Are we live? Okay, excellent. All right. Okay, well, welcome back for those of you who are in Calgary with me, and welcome to our friends who are joining us virtually. My name is Dr. Maureen Hiebert. I'm the acting director and graduate program director at the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies, and I'm going to be essentially the chair of the two panels for today. We've got lots of great research to be presented, and so I want to get straight to our panelists. Just a reminder, I think all of you are scheduled for 20 minutes, so if I can ask all of you to please keep to that time so we can have a full accounting of everybody's research, but make sure that there's room for everybody. What I'm going to do, because our owl friend here is a little bit persnickety, I think I'm going to just introduce all of our panelists on panel one. I'll have them present in their turn. We'll have a Q&A after that, and then we'll have a short break, and then on to panel two. So our first presenter for panel one is Mohammed Sakib. Mohammed is currently a graduate student in natural resource management at the University of Manitoba, my undergraduate alma mater, and a research assistant at the Conflict and Resilience Research Institute, Canada. He is the holder of the University of Manitoba Graduate Scholarship and the International Graduate Student Entrance Scholarship for Fall 2022. He was awarded the Chancellor of Merit Scholarship by the Bangladesh University of Professionals. He also received the EU Peace Scholarship from 2018 to 2020 for his academic excellence. Mohammed was born and raised in Dhaka, Bangladesh. He has completed his bachelor's from Bangladesh University of Professionals in Disaster and Human Security Management and the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences in 2022. Our second presenter, I'm sorry, and I forgot to say that Mohammed's paper is Effective Disaster Management and Multi-Stakeholder Role, a Case of Bangladesh. Our second presenter, I just have to get this on the screen here, is Haval Ahmad from Royal Roads University. His paper is entitled Next Wave of Jihadists or Deradicalized Citizens, a Controlled Narrative from a Human Security and Social Identity Perspective. Haval is an associate faculty and researcher with Royal Roads University, teaching in the MA Human Security and Peacebuilding, MA Justice Studies, and MA Global Leadership Studies program. So that's a lot of different, really interesting stuff. His research focuses on violent extremism, radicalization, de-radicalization, political violence, and geopolitical dynamics, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa region and Kurdish affairs. Ahmad's most recent work includes leading a research team on behalf of the International Center for Counterterrorism for the European Commission to identify gaps in training needs for EU professionals working with European ISIS-affiliated children and youth returnees to the European Union. Our third presenter is Ash Grover from Brock University. Her paper is entitled Trauma, Culture, and Militarism, Multi-Dimensional Healing in the Canadian Armed Forces. Ash is a PhD candidate in educational studies at Brock University, where her research focuses on the intersection of trauma-informed and culturally sustaining pedagogies in the university context. Ash is also a curriculum development specialist in the Department of Learning Services at Brock, and her goal is to enhance the learning experience of all students through addressing the barriers that equity-seeking communities often face when accessing post-secondary education. Her interest in transforming military culture is inspired by her ongoing research with Dr. Nancy Hiebert in the areas of public pedagogy, militarism, and intersectional feminist praxis. And our fourth presenter for this panel is Isabelle Richer, whose last name I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. She is with the Director General Military Personnel Research and Analysis. Her paper is entitled Approches afin de comprendre et surveiller la culture au sein de l'équipe de la défense. Dr. Isabelle Richer is a defense scientist and has worked with the Director General Military Personnel Research and Analysis team since 2014. She joined the organization following a postdoctoral fellowship in community health at the University of Sherbrooke and a doctorate in psychology from the University of Montreal. Her research focuses on the psychosocial aspects relating to the health, family adjustment, and well-being of Canadian Armed Forces members and their families. Specifically, she is part of the Chief Professional Conduct and Culture Group that contributes to the development of a research program examining conduct and culture throughout the defense team. She also leads a working group that studies the lived experiences of members of the defense team and an international NATO activity focused on innovative approaches to understanding military culture. So without further ado, we will turn to our first speaker, Mohammed.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So, today my presentation topic is the effective disaster management and multi-stakeholder role, a case study of Bangladesh. So let's move on to the next slide. I think this has come, so let's move on to the next one. Can we just, yeah. So the thing is that disaster is basically a very complex situation. When it arises, it could arise due to human induced hazards, or it could be natural induced hazards. But the thing is that it also depends upon when a community or a country actually has actually the capacity of coping from that particular situation and getting to the normal situation. When it gets hard, we term it as disaster. And disaster is particularly socially constructed as well. So now, why we are talking about Bangladesh, we are going to talk about some background as well. Next slide. Yeah, can we just have... Yeah, so basically Bangladesh is a country in Southeast Asia. So it's a very small country. It's beside India and Myanmar. So the land area is very small. It's like 147,570 square kilometers. And you just click on, it will appear. Yeah, so the land area is very small. Can you just click it again? Yeah. So the population is quite high, actually, in such a small land mass. The population is about, can you just please? Yeah, it's about 169.4 million by 2021 census. It's a very small country, but it has a large population. So the major disasters what strikes are cyclone, then earthquake. It hasn't been that much. So then flood, as 80% of the land is floodplain, and we have lightning. It is also a national declared disaster, and we also have drought as well as a problem in our country. In a floodplain, we also have drought. So this was the background of the country. So we have a small amount of land, limited resources, huge amount of population to feed upon. And this is one image from a cyclone of 1991. It was a devastating cyclone. And this is going to be quite interesting. Can you just click? Yeah. So this is for this cyclone, near about 138,816 people died at that cyclone. It was a huge number. The cash was like, the loss was estimated 1.7 billion. United States and other countries operated this military and civil relief effort, which was carried out. And fast forward to 2007, in Cyclone Cedar, the fatality rate was near about 3 to 15,000 in total, and the loss was only 2.31 billion. So the human loss, or the human life loss, was pretty much less either, but both of the cyclones were category 4 cyclones. They had the same intensity, but Bangladesh was successfully able to manage successfully without any external assistance. So this was a very good case study where Bangladesh actually, from having high amount of debt, having low amount of debt, and becoming self-reliant on their resources. So this was a case study, and how Bangladesh did that, and what was the challenges and how they overcame. We will talk about it now. So first, Bangladesh, what did is they addressed what is the problem is actually arising. So the problem was basically nothing. The problem was the land was small and the population was huge and the resources were limited. So what Bangladesh did, the next slide, they developed the SOD, the Standing Order of Disasters. From then, it was maybe started formulating from 2004, and then what they did is, in that particular document, the government of Bangladesh, the NGOs, armed forces, and also the corporates, also other stakeholders, they have stated roles, who will do what and who will respond when, who has the power, who has the authority to do what. It was mentioned in that standing on a disaster. And every year they have a revision, and every year they change. After any disaster or anything, they would have a revision and they would change the role. Every year they do it. But how do they do it? That's where the thing actually goes upon, because in a small amount of resources, you cannot allocate any mistake every time, and you cannot change it quite frequently whenever you want. So that's the challenge. How to do that? And Bangladesh is a developing nation. It's hard to afford all these mistakes, and there is no space of doing uh, what we call it, that trial and error. So how to address all these things? So it started addressing with okay, can we go on the next slide? I think I have spoken about this one as well. Yeah, the limited amount of resources, the limited amount of money, and also the climate change is being a very huge problem. And Bangladesh has ranked one of the highest climate vulnerable countries as well. Can I have the next slide? Yeah, so then they started doing such kind of activities. They started design and development of the plan, conducting the plan, how it would go on, evaluate and improve the plan about the standing out of disaster. They actually started doing this kind of activities, which actually is still going on and which will be going on in the future as well. Next slide. So how do they do that? So all the stakeholders come into a table. They it's like a puzzle. They actually take those pieces and they try to communicate with each other, and they try to connect with each other. So, but how? But there is, as I have mentioned, there is no space of doing trial and error. So how we can do that? So there where the exercise or the case studies come actually in. So can I have the next slide? So there where the Bangladesh government has introduced this thing, the disaster response exercise and exchange, which is a program done by the government of Bangladesh, the Bangladesh Armed Forces, and also the US Pacific. And in that particular exercise in 2021, almost armed forces of 20 plus countries participated. It's an exercise. It's a 4 or 5 day exercise. I was fortunate enough to join one of these exercises. Government organization from 20 countries also visited, and international and local NGOs and universities also joined that exercise. That exercise was on particularly on earthquake, but there are other exercises which goes on in the governmental level as well. But this exercise is open for all, and anyone from Canada or anywhere in the world can actually register and join that exercise as well. Can I have the next slide? So how this exercise goes on? What is the procedure of this exercise? Next slide. So in the exercise, there are two particular things which are based on. This is an AI-based exercise, also a human-based exercise. This is a hybrid exercise, basically. So in the human part, what we have is the humans create a scenario. Suppose we have Richter scale 10 or 8 earthquake in a particular city of Bangladesh. What would happen? And then there are going to be people who are going to sit there and talk about we should do this, we should do that. There are many teams divided, and also the international teams. Everyone will be there. They would talk about the input and the plans, the tabletop exercises, and then that thing is going to get on the input in the AI, and afterwards they would execute the exercise practically at a small scale, like one building or something. I think you should click it. The AI part will come. Yeah, so we have this AI part. So in the AI part, we have this the existing data and the simulation of the real world. And then they will actually assess the plan throughout the simulation. Like when the people or the human beings are actually setting up a plan, setting up to the scenario, AI is going to create a scenario like the real world, and they would say that, okay, your plan has this problem. If you execute this plan, this might happen or that might happen. This kind of thing will come out. And then that feedback is given, and from that feedback, that exercise or the small scale exercise is being conducted. The next slide. So what happens in that exercise and how it's executed? So in day one, all the stakeholders from home and abroad, they would come and they would speak about their plans, or what kind of emergency management plans they have, and what type of uh, procedures or government orders they have. And this is the first day, just for introduction and plans and procedures. In day 2, which is known as the exercise part, the human exercise part, where they are going to be working on a particular scenario. They are going to talk about plans, like uh, one group is going to work on the dead body management, one group is going to be on the rescue, one group is going to be on the medical team. These kind of teams will make plans and they will present it. And in the part of day 3, and this is going to get on the input on the AI-based software, which is in the day 3. There will be a presentation that, okay, this team A is going to execute this plan if something happens. Team B is going to do this, and those things are going to get into the input of that particular software, and this thing is going to run. And after that, the software is going to give that, okay, this plan, in your plan, if you do this, this amount of people will die, this amount of damage might happen, etc., etc. And from there, on day 4, there will be a disaster drill in the field. As I have mentioned, that I participated in a drill which was on of a earthquake. So in that earthquake, what they're going to do is they're going to simulate it that one building is going to face an earthquake, and what the stakeholders will do. And in day 5, there is going to be a discussion panel about it, that who did the plan. There are going to be some discussion about what were the lacking, what were the problems in the planning, and the team which has produced one of the best plans from that simulation are going to get awards. So this is a part, and from there the government has also improved some of the plannings and procedures on the standing order of disaster as well. Like this is a learning process. It will never end, because disaster is dynamic. This is not a static thing. So way forward, what has Bangladesh has achieved throughout this? Throughout this, Bangladesh has actually, I have shown that in 2007 there were less people who died in the cyclone, the same category in 1991. So this was the achievement, was what Bangladesh is currently doing on, and they're moving on to much more resilience. And it's a never-ending process. It's an ongoing process, and you cannot actually say that this is the magic bullet which will end up the disaster and the impact of disaster quite easily. So it actually helps in one thing, that it's about the, can I have the next slide? So due to this exercise, the loss of human being got less, and we had a very good plan. Like there is no conflict of interest here, that, okay, the military is going to do this, or okay, the military is confused, or the government is confused. There is no, they're not going to be repetitive actions, because everything is now predetermined. Who is going to do what? How many resources I have? How many resources this X organization has have? Everyone knows about it. So as per the resources, we can actually build our own capacity. We can find out that where our lackings are. So this exercise helped us in this manner. And if we just click again, yeah. So all the multiple stakeholders are actually coming together. They have no conflict. They're doing their own duties. So this is a very good thing for us to determine that if there is no possibility or probability of things that might get duplicated, or like X organization and Y organization is working on dead body management together, or they're working on relief management together. So this kind of duplication is avoided throughout this exercise because of this exercise. And moving forward, and for this reason, the Ministry of Disaster and Relief got an award by the United Nations as one of the effective and efficient ministries around, or the offices around the world. So it was a very proud moment for us for this reason. And moving on to the next slide. Okay, so I think this is the end of my slide. If there are questions, I'm open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Good. So we'll go on to the next presenter.
Okay, thank you.
Blue slides here instead of just looking back and forth.
Yeah.
First of all, just thank CDSN and CMSS for bringing us together here, and also giving us the opportunity to share our findings. Thank you. The research here started back in 2018, where ISIS was still in power and had established so-called caliphate. The primary focus of the research was to look into what drives children and youth to join radical extremes such as ISIS. In 2019, after the defeat of the so-called caliphate, the focus was the research changed focus to how do we de-radicalize the children, especially after the physical defeat of ISIS, where over 75,000 ISIS-affiliated women and children are left behind. Most of those children and women were in detention centers in a place called Haval camp in northeast Syria. Those women and children were either captured or surrendered to the Kurdish authorities in northeast Syria or captured by the coalition forces. The camp at its peak reached 77,000 people. Over 46,000 of those were children under the age of 18. Now, most of those children, close to 90% of those children were from foreign nationals. Foreign nationals, by that we mean they were not Syrians, even though they were in Kurdish territories, still in Syria. However, they were all foreign nationals. The biggest portion of them were Iraqis, but we're also having foreign nationals, including Canadians as well. The largest portion of non-Iraqi in Syria, of course, come from parts of Europe and Southeast Asia in particular. We'll look at one slide. So the problem, we talked about the initial aim, but then the aim became to develop a framework for de-radicalization of these children in Syria and Iraq. It was expanded afterward because those children and youth, especially in 2019, most of the states, as we know by now, they were hesitant to repatriate those children and women back to the countries. We've seen Canada being elected, and recently Canada just decided to take the women, very few women back in Canada and very few children. As of January 2023, the government announced they would bring more women and children, but that hasn't, to the best of my knowledge, it hasn't been done yet. And there are about 2,000 left still in the camp in Syria. And those are the self-identified Canadians in Canada, probably people that refuse to self-identify for different reasons. So therefore, the research question began, how can cultural and social aspects of the region be incorporated to de-radicalize children and youth previously lived in ISIS control? The reason why we focus on the cultural and religious aspect of the region, even though we're talking about foreign children as well, because most of the children who joined ISIS in 2014, today they're 9 or 10 years old. If they were 5 years old when they first were forced to join as a result of them getting traveled to go to Syria or to Iraq. Now they're teens, right? So therefore, they spend all their lives, as far as we know, in ISIS control or in the region of Syria and Iraq. And therefore, the cultural context, the religious context of the region where they're currently being held need to be important for their de-radicalization or reintegration. To give you some background, can you go to the next slide? So these are some statistics I got from camp administration in northeast Syria, both camps. So the main camp is Al camp, the other camp is known as Roche camp. Roche camp, the second camp is the one usually holds the most extremist women and children who are still holding extreme views toward the West and everyone else who doesn't, even extreme views toward former ISIS members who are starting to denounce ISIS ideology. Those are the ones who basically were transferred from Al camp to Roche camp after the start setting fires in the tents of those women and children who decided to avoid ISIS ideology. So we have a smaller population there, but if you pay close attention to the number of children, because we have a breakdown of age, over 45,000 of those are children under age 18. Although my research covered up to the age of 19, age of 24, because they challenged the notion of cutoff age of 18 as a legal age, because we're talking about the cognitive abilities, psychological, many other levels, many other aspects to incorporate the definition of youth. But even with the going with the age of 18, we're 45,000, just over 45,000 under the age of 18. Now, what we discovered during my discussion with data collection and through interviews, which I'll talk about a bit, that most of the children, if not all, were under heavy indoctrination by the hardcore extremist model in the camp. So we were leading these children to be, but despite their existing radicalization and trauma, while being under ISIS control, they were being subject to daily indoctrination by extremists. So we can go to the next slide now. So we'll talk about a bit of background. Children and youth exposed to extreme violence during the control of ISIS while ISIS was in power, but continues to do so in the camp, in both camps. But what adds to the aspect of trauma and radicalization is the historical context of radicalization. You can see here the right, which we'll be talking about as well. Radicalization existed in the region way before ISIS. Even before the emergence of Al-Qaeda. Radicalization can be traced back to the 80s and 70s in Syria and Iraq, sponsored by both regimes in Syria and Iraq, by the Assad regime and by the Saddam Hussein regime, which we'll be talking about in a bit. So the idea of radicalization and dying for a cause has always been part of the religious narrative, or the extreme religious narrative in Syria. Therefore, ISIS didn't find it hard to actually capitalize on this existing perceived ideas. Go to the next slide. So there is a legitimate qualitative thematic analysis in research, given that I hate quantitative research, I don't want to deal with that. But also this type of research requires more qualitative analysis. We need to understand, we need to get to the mind and perceptions of people even in this. And what hopefully you get help us to figure out what these children and youth also are thinking, what's the position at this point, but thanks to the ethical process and difficulties and barriers, that was not an option. So we conducted semi-structured interviews with participants from Iraq and Syria. Those were 29 interviews, included 4 different categories: community members, NGO workers who work with the radicalized children and youth in the camp and outside of the camp. Some of these children who are back in the communities. Policymakers includes members of parliament in Iraq, ministers in Iraq, and also leaders from the YPG and YPJ Kurdish forces in northeast Syria who were either part of the battle and capturing stolen children and transferred to the camp, or are in charge of the security of the camp. So they were in daily contact with the children. And again, children and youth were excluded from data collection because of, again, the ethical considerations, but also because the research was done as part of, slow down. The research was, interpreter can catch up. While the research was being conducted, it was under the supervision of Approches University in Wales in the UK, and therefore we have to be very careful with the anti-terror British law that if any child discloses any information about any involvement in terrorist activity, then under that terror law, we have to report that to British authorities, which again causes a problem. How do you protect your participants? How do you maintain the confidentiality, especially the vulnerable children? So with that reason, coupled with ethical barriers, collecting data from children, because children are considered vulnerable population in research community, children were excluded. An attempt was made to have silent observation of children activity in the camp, but even that was for ethical reasons. It was rejected. So therefore, as much as they wanted to incorporate observation for some inputs from children, that wasn't an option. We move to the next slide. To how they get sort of identity theory, I had to look into a number of theories to figure out what's the best way we can understand why children and youth get into this line of radicalization, other than the fact that those who are being forced or taken by the extreme scales to Syria and Iraq to fight for the cause. What about those who are joining voluntarily? And also, if we're claiming those who are joining voluntarily, can we really claim and confirm their participation is voluntary, given their cognitive abilities and psychological needs and many other needs as well? Can a child consent to participate in armed conflict? What are the incentives? Are there certain incentives? Is this misinterpretation? Are there perceived injustices? I had to look at all these facts, and therefore I went through a number of theories to help me understand that. So I went through, I did some analysis of sociological approaches, including frustration aggression theory, multiple deprivation theory. I went through psychodynamic approach theories, individual psychology theory, cognitive theories, personality, and Kelly's constructive theory as well. Every theory of this did provide some explanation, but not to the extent that really explains radicalization in a broad sense. Because while one context, one theory explain one aspect of radicalization, let's say frustration aggression theory, right? People are, some participants would state that, The child is frustrated because of the American invasion of Iraq, right? And this is, the child wasn't even born back then. How does it explain? This isn't the other they heard from their parents or from the media, perhaps. 2003, those are not children anymore at this point. So some narratives we heard over and over, they were like secondary narratives, sort of. So therefore, we dismissed that frustration in this theory. Other theories would basically have limitations in its application to radicalization, and more specifically, deradicalization. And this now we ended up with social identity. Let's like. Correct. Post-materials. No. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you click? Can you enter again?
Okay.
Thanks so much. Yeah. So, a theory developed by the International in 1979, came into force in 1981, which was heavily criticizing the early 80s, but 81, it was pretty much more adopted in the literature to explain how people self-categorize themselves and then move into the process of identifying themselves and therefore based on the group comparison. Examples could include like daily life. We all went through the same process. We categorize ourselves. Let's say we're Alberta now, categorized by being Alberta, right? You associate yourself with Alberta politics, but then you identify yourself to be an Albertan, let's say, conservative party supporter, right? So this is the next stage of the process is self-identification. Once you self-identify yourself, you move on to the self-comparison and compare yourself to the other. And this is where the polarization starts in the process. So normally this doesn't necessarily mean it's an unhealthy process, but in the case of extremism and radicalization, this is where the organization of the outgroup begins. It does explain the process of radicalization. But while looking into de-radicalization, we thought maybe this actually would provide a mechanism or serve as a framework or theoretical framework to de-radicalize, to do some sort of a reverse process to bring this people back into de-radicalization, reintegrating them. So we move on to the next slide. And while looking into that, we identified religion to be as one of the key identity elements. So when I looked into elements of what constructed the extremist identity. I said that capitalize on existing narratives in the region, and therefore they utilize religion to a great extent to children into the ranks. It's wrong to assume most of the children were taken by their parents. Those foreigners, yes, most of them did go with their parents, but we also have young girls and boys aged 16 and 17 who traveled Syria and Iraq freely without being intercepted by security forces, like we've seen the case with the three which girls, one of them, Shalima begins, currently still in refugee camp, in detention camp in North Syria. Those are they willingly made a decision to go. But again, that notion of willingly could be challenged on so many levels, but on the legal level or philosophical level, right? Because how much does a 16-year-old know, right? But religion was a main component in convincing someone like Shalima began and our to buy into the argument narrative of ISIS buying, and some of the story we heard about the presentation of this information narrative, right? Like how easily it's happy to this existing narrative to follow through. For someone like Shalima began, our youth, the narrative of the West versus Islam, or the West is in the war against Islam, or I was never British, or I was never Canadian, or I was never French. Always played and were amplified by radical extremist founders and youth platforms. So therefore, religion was a main component to it, but also the portrayal that Islam was constantly under attack by the West. That was another key element that ISIS utilized in their recruiting process. But because it's a main, because I found that to be a main argument or main key or in the recruitment process. The analysis also showed that it could be also utilizing de-radicalization, right? Because by bringing some modern religious interpretations or community members who actually can provide different interpretation about these perceived injustices or actual injustices, we can help children and youth, even this applies to adults as well, to help them de-radicalize or denounce some of the extremist interpretation of the religious texts. Examples could include what's happening here in Calgary, the Redirect program, which is being led by the Calgary Police Department in collaboration with community services. On the program, they have a religious, well-respected, moderate religious member from the state of Calgary who's working in the police department, and other community stakeholders as well. So religion can be heavily incorporated in de-radicalization because it's the starting point for radicalization itself in the case of Islamic extremism. And it provides different interpretation and more acceptable interpretation, not only for religious texts, but also the evidence, as Islamic extremists can to utilize the bar for interpretation. We can move to our next slide. Did anyone keep track of that? 5 minutes left? Okay, so let's get this. I'm trying to be mindful of time, okay. I've been talking for 8 minutes. All right. All right. So the response to terrorism, we're looking into how states are responding to terrorism. Generally, we keep saying we. My findings concluded that there were two main approaches: secretization and soft approaches. We start to see more soft approaches recently, like last year or two, more so in the last year. But the default of most of the states or state actors have always been skewed response. And what we've seen nowadays, right, the reluctance in perpetrating with children and back into their home countries is an example of why security response is mentioned, because if these children and youth come back into their countries, that poses security threat to these member states for their national security. And these are all very legitimate concerns, right? The case of Aaron Driver, a youth in Canada, radicalized youth a few years ago, probably 2016 or 17 in Toronto, who was a peace bloc who did a bomb in a vaccine when he was on his way to downtown Toronto. Yes, he was a minor. Again, he should have his chance for justice. But again, there was credible evidence that he was about to commit an act of terrorism. So all these security concerns are very valid. But at the same time, while we're considering these security concerns, is there something else we can do to de-radicalize? In the case of the women who have been repatriated to Canada so far, none of them has been charged with any criminal offense, and they cannot even enter peace law. And the reason for that is lack of evidence. So because investigators are going to travel to Syria or Iraq with evidence, and I'm assuming it's been a costly process as well, to monitor this individual. I'm sure they're being monitored 24/7, but again, with lack of evidence, it's a security risk to bring those individuals back. But in the context of children and youth, it's a whole different scenario. With women, fine, we keep them there or establish some sort of a mechanism to try them there. But with children and youth, by not doing something else besides security measures, we are actually contributing to the promotion of the narrative that Islamic extremists groups are promoting, that is us versus them, or we were never friends, we were never again. Some of the information I got from the participants, those who work directly with these children and with the camp and officials, is that at any point where foreigners or an NGO worker, camp official, even security forces involved in this camp, it's a massacre camp. They get attacked by children under the directions of their mothers and women generally. Why? Because of the notion that's being pushed by C. These are the people who you think you were part of that community, the citizen of, but they don't want you. They're only here to collect intelligence. They're only here to take a photo and have a media story for you. Next slide, see if there's anything quickly. I'll just slide quickly to the next slide. They did say I'm going to talk about background extremism, terrorism extremism in Syria and Iraq. You can just hold it at once. Okay. Thank you.
There you go.
That's fine. So I challenge the notion of sovereignty, the notion of Westphalian sovereignty as a cause of, not a cause, it's one of the leading causes of radicalization in the region, although it was emphasized back. The reason for that is because the establishment of this political boundaries and political borders did lead to the division of tribes in Syria and Iraq. These countries, as a result, were made of tribes, and these tribes and families were divided into a number of countries, and that raised tension between the political structure of these countries. What added to that also this created tension between the Shia and the Sunnis in the region. And regimes like Assad regime and Saddam Hussein's regime tapped into that to stay in power for all the Sunni states for decades. For example, the land clubs of Saddam Hussein the term blind cops. ISIS was not the first organization to use the term blind cops. Saddam Hussein actually came up with that. He's the founder of that term. He established what was known as Alliance of Cop. And indoctrination against Saddam Hussein's regime included basically sending detention markers to Palestine for the legitimate cause, training youth and children in Iraq. Schools starting from grade 1, and it included military uniforms. Like in Syria was the same practice. In Syria, under the Assad regime, the Assad father, not the current one, but even the same the son as well. The term was used as Shafal al-Assad, which also translated the cops of the land. So you can see both regimes really have those similar concepts and ideas to push forward the idea of martyrs and dying for a cause. As a matter of fact, see under the Assad regime, he did send a number of martyrs to target certain locations in Israel and in Lebanon as well. And those were praised. Institutions were named after them, streets were named after them, so generally were celebrated. So the idea of dying for the cause of religion or for a political cause was always celebrated. Right up I'm out of time. I'll conclude it in 30 seconds. The findings have been concluded in 30 seconds. What I found based on all this information, based on the empirical data analysis, that the best approach to adopt in de-radicalization remains to be a community-based approach to de-radicalization rather than a state-sponsored approach, which will always be perceived as an intelligence gathering operation by states, even though it's not, but that's a common perception. An example includes British model of prevent. Thank you.
Okay, Ash, it's our next presenter.
Okay, good afternoon. Am I coming through okay?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So as mentioned, my name is Ash Grover. I'm here today to share a paper that I wrote with you that is now called Trauma and Military Cultures. I changed the name slightly. So I wanted to first say thank you so much for inviting me to be here and to share this research among so many brilliant people. I am already blown away by the presentations that I've seen. So this is a really valuable afternoon for me. So thank you so much for that. And I'd also like to thank the Transforming Military Cultures co-directors for allowing me to sort of bring my own PhD research into my work that I do with them in order to sort of come to this topic and to think through this paper. And finally, I do want to say that I am grateful to be Zooming and joining you virtually today from Brock University on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. So this land that I am on is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and the Dish with One Spoon Agreement. And I like to acknowledge the land that I'm on just in terms of sort of bringing history, the history of this space into the conversation. But okay, so if you don't mind, perfect, thank you. So today I'm going to be talking to you about trauma and military culture, healing, multidimensional healing in the Canadian Armed Forces. And for those of you who may be wondering why trauma, why healing, hopefully that will all make sense in about 15 to 20 minutes from now. I'm going to talk briefly about the definition of trauma that I use. I'm coming to this from a sociological and educational background. I will talk about trauma in the context of military culture, look at sort of the role that organizational cultures play, and thinking about how we can sustain and transform different aspects of a culture simultaneously. And then finally, I will discuss this concept of multidimensional healing a little bit, specifically the idea of building community without erasure. Okay, so on the next slide, slide and in this next moment, I am just sharing with you a little bit about my personal and working definition of trauma. So trauma encapsulates interpersonal harm as well as structural violence. It can be caused by violence, abuse, neglect, but it can also be caused by structural oppression, such as sexism, racism, homophobia, ableism, poverty, and colonialism. So I got this sort of piece of my working definition from this article from Bim and Feldman, as well as sort of looking at how persistent systems of harm or domination, either sort of as a perpetrator or as a victim, can often trigger a set of symptoms which have come to be labeled post-traumatic or complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's PTSD and CPTSD. These consistent and single experiences alike can both trigger PTSD and CPTSD, according to the literature. And the common element between them is usually an inability to process and therefore a desire to disassociate, freeze, numb, or to flee from often challenging emotions. So I come to this from a trauma lens because I think it's an important consideration due to trauma's pervasiveness in military institutions. I think trauma can be caused by both the enactment and the experience of violence. It's caused often through ambient oppression and consistent discrimination, and sometimes also chronically stressful experiences, which folks are often unable to process or to sort of make sense of. I think this is particularly a very useful way into conversations around transforming military culture or cultural evolution in the Canadian Armed Forces specifically, because questions often come back to the idea of getting buy-in from the Canadian Armed Forces, from membership within, as well as from leadership. So I would argue that trauma, PTSD, and CPTSD often contribute to a limited buy-in for initiatives that are focused on culture change. So for example, often individuals who are targeted by equity initiatives hope to distance themselves from any discourse on culture change because typically they've worked really hard to already escape this idea of being othered. Usually as what I would call a survival strategy or a coping mechanism that's born out of a PTSD or CPTSD response. So we may commonly hear of women who have worked tirelessly to present as though they are genderless in order to not draw attention to themselves or be othered. Or we might have similarly heard of racialized soldiers in the Canadian Armed Forces who water down their cultural subjectivities in order to fit in with colleagues. Both of these experiences and the emotions which accompany them can create intense barriers for folks who are wanting to be centered in advocacy. And while PTSD doesn't necessarily ring true for all communities and individuals who have not necessarily escaped the ongoing sort of persistence of harm. So often people are not sort of they're not past it. It is an effective label for the types of psychological, physiological, and emotional responses that accompany chronic oppressive conditions. So often for folks who are living with CPTSD or PTSD, change and transformation can be quite frightening. And it can conjure emotions related to a loss of control. And for these reasons, trauma-informed practice is quite valuable in the context of military culture change. Perfect timing with the slide change. So this is why I bring in sort of a lens of trauma-informed practice or pedagogy. So based on contemporary definitions of trauma, emerging literature on trauma-informed practice includes these three principles. So one would be an acknowledgement that trauma is vast and often connected to larger social structures. So it's less looking at, this relates to the second principle as well, it's less looking at the individual and more looking at the system. So it addresses trauma as a systemic issue rather than individual. And the third principle is that it promotes healing through an overall systems change and through community accountability. So when I apply this concept of trauma-informed pedagogy to the idea of military culture change, when I was making this application, I saw a connection to a concept from the social sciences called a double consciousness. So if you can move to the next slide. So beginning with W.E. Du Bois and then expanded on by Frantz Fanon, double consciousness interrogates the ways that oppressed groups often come to view themselves through the eyes of an oppressive and dominating culture. So if we were to apply the concept of apply double consciousness to looking at military culture, we might see how the processes of othering that are inherent to a system that asks for universality, uniformity, and warrior ideals would lead to the development of a double consciousness in military members who are asked to subjugate aspects of their identity or subjectivity in order to be a successful member of the CAF. The Canadian Armed Forces is CAF, just for those who are coming from a more international context. So trauma-informed practice acknowledges that the conditions of historical, ideological, cultural, and institutional superiority result in a double consciousness or a sense of inferiority in dominated or marginalized groups. This requires an understanding of this idea that Fanon brought forward, that the colonizer creates the other in their own image. So Fanon said, "Let us have the courage to say it. It is the racist who creates the inferiorized." So he's specifically talking about race in this situation, whereas I'm using double consciousness more broadly, looking at this phenomena of othering across many sort of points of difference. So for culture change to avoid further othering those communities who have been historically harmed or excluded, I say that it must seek to interrogate the systems that produce others. If we acknowledge how the process of othering is a microcosm of larger social structures, we can hopefully work to address the trauma that's caused by double consciousness as a systemic issue that requires accountability and effort on part of the entire organization. So there's a quote here that reads, "Trauma-informed teaching has an embedded social justice perspective that seeks to dissemble oppressive systems." So this means that it is a systems-wide organizational issue that we're looking at when we're talking about culture change. Excuse me. So if you could move to the next slide. Thank you. So it was in discussing sort of organizational cultures, it was Schein who argued that there are three main aspects of a culture that should be examined. And those would be artifacts, beliefs and values, and then underlying basic assumptions. So of those three aspects, Wong and Jarris have argued the following, and I'll just read this quote to you that is also on the screen. "While artifacts are the observable clues of a culture, an organization's values reveal more of the motivations and rationale of the organizational culture. Of course, an organization's stated values may not match its demonstrated values. In order to determine the values and beliefs that an organization actually puts into use, as opposed to merely espousing, it is necessary to look deeper into the next level of cultural analysis. Beneath an organization's beliefs and values is the third level of an organizational culture, the underlying basic assumptions. This underlying consensus of unseen and usually unconscious assumptions affects the perceptions, thought processes, and behaviors of an organization." So I appreciate this description of organizational culture because I think that it highlights how culture change requires critical examination of those underlying basic assumptions. And those have overt as well as subtle consequences. So they can be quite difficult sometimes to pinpoint. So for example, an underlying assumption of current culture within the Canadian Armed Forces is that increased diversity of membership will lead to incremental culture change. So bring in more people who are different and the culture will change. But as Al Okros and others have argued, the labels that we give to denote difference often serve no one but the dominant group. So again, this relates back to Fanon's concept of double consciousness. Okros states, "A key question arising from the new CAF diversity strategy is how diversity will be constructed and how the experiences of those in underrepresented groups will be understood." So how are differing lived experiences actually valued in CAF practice? What role do the underlying basic assumptions of the Canadian Armed Forces play in how difference actually gets attended to in practice? If a key belief driving the Canadian Armed Forces is that uniformity will enhance operational effectiveness, what happens to folks on a socio-emotional level when they are brought into the fold and positioned as being different? They are often instinctively viewed as a threat to operational effectiveness, especially if they refuse to give up what makes them different in order to be one of the many. And thus, they may become understood as a threat to the safety, belonging, and dignity of others who have developed a double consciousness in order to serve a greater purpose. So in this example, increased representation and emphasis on including those who have been historically othered without addressing the contradicting beliefs or underlying assumptions fails to create meaningful change and can actually reproduce systems of harm. Okay, so the next slide, please. So if we're thinking about what aspects and underlying assumptions, what aspects of the culture do we sustain and what do we evolve? When we're examining the underlying assumptions, the beliefs and values and the artifacts of military culture, we might begin to work with membership in order to identify what they think needs sustaining and what they identify as needing to evolve or transform. The culture in the Canadian Armed Forces effectively demonstrates the strength of a community when people feel as though they belong and are affirmed. That is certainly a strength. So to an extent, the CAF achieves this in their principle of equity by design and through ideals such as community first, putting the community before self. In terms of recognizing our socio-emotional well-being, this sense of interconnectedness is incredibly valuable. However, when an institution asks for universality from its members, it's important to consider the boundaries of that uniformity or universality. So what is being lost when boundaries don't exist? Further, if there is a culture of complacency within the Canadian Armed Forces around such things as sexism, racism, homophobia, and other forms of oppression, when the CAF is asking for uniformity from their members, they are inherently reproducing that complacency. It's important to ask ourselves what is being lost when we ask for universality and to follow cues from the membership when it comes to deciding which elements of an organizational culture are working and what needs to be changed. Building a sense of community and responsibility to one another is incredibly valuable, and this has to go beyond operational effectiveness and into the realm of what I call mutual holistic well-being. So it's a delicate balance between that operational effectiveness and the well-being of both the individual and the community, as well as an overall awareness of how any organization acts as a microcosm of society, so therefore reproduces inequitable power dynamics that need to be addressed. So when we're talking about this idea of mutual well-being, I think when you're working to sort of address inequitable power dynamics, to care for the individual and to care for the community in tandem, there can often be conflict. But I argue that conflict can be generative. Sometimes conflict can serve a purpose. And when it most sort of moves into being, thank you for the time warning, when it moves into being generative is when people feel a sense of belonging and a sense of community. So they're able to work through conflict, when they feel a sense of deep respect and empathy. Okay, so the next slide, please. And this is my last slide. So moving forward with the idea of emphasizing emotional intelligence and well-being, the following question emerges for me when thinking about culture change in the Canadian Armed Forces. What would it look like to foster a culture that witnesses and affirms the painful experiences of its members as well as civilians? If we think back to the aspects of an organizational culture, so artifacts, beliefs and values, and underlying assumptions, we can see how one of the underlying assumptions of the CAF is that being in the military requires emotional fortitude on part of individual members, rather than a reliance on collective fortitude and community belonging. So it's sort of like put on the individual to be emotionally flexible. It actually is within the values that are in the updated call for universality of service that discuss concepts such as emotional flexibility and a fighting spirit. But what if we were thinking more about emotional intelligence and resilience that comes out of a sense of community? So I actually argue that in order for members of the CAF to feel a sense of belonging, they need to be supported in developing community that's founded in mutuality and trust. And I totally lied. This isn't my last slide. I just have one more. If you can move to the next one. I'm sorry about that. So the main sort of goal in building that community is to meet these three principles. So I'll quickly read through them and then I'll be done. So ultimately, trauma-informed pedagogy can inform military culture change guided by these three principles that you see on the screen. So one would be fostering a sense of safety, belonging, and dignity for military members at all levels and ranks. A focus on holistic well-being, following the lead of those who have been historically harmed. And three, a framework of feminist anti-oppression for enacting military culture change. I believe that beginning with these three steps is a path forward in the goal of building community without erasure in the Canadian Armed Forces. Thank you so much.
Hey, Isabelle.
Bonjour tout le monde. Merci pour l'opportunité de présenter.
Good morning, everyone. I am the team leader for the approaches of the national defense system. Today, I'm going to how we challenge our defense system in order to best understand. Alors, we would like to underline the state that I am today. I'm in the national capital. It's part of the Algonquins and Anishinaabe, who has always been served as God among the nations. Le prochain. Next one. Alors, during the last years, the media's reports, the evaluation, the external evaluation, as well as the research done by the Canadian forces and the Ministry of the Defense, they have proven that including the discrimination, the different the leaders recognize the importance of to change the culture organizational, and they are spending all kinds of researchers. There is also, they installed a chief for the CCPC who is working for the change of culture of the organization. And in order to change the culture, we have to understand the following causes, the systemic causes, and that's why my team is to do. So to go backwards a little bit, these subjects have been lengthily studied by the defense and the Canadian forces, and they have been realized internally,
comme l'épidémiologie des inconduites notamment, et puis dans une moindre mesure sur la compréhension plus en
and we'll have all the measures, and we'll have all the subcultures of the systemic behaviors. In general, there have been individual behaviors, the perceptions, attitudes. In general, we put in importance the structural factors, the institutional, the sexual racism, the inequalities, and the big the patriarchal inequalities, abuse, and the colonialism. And in systemic errors of behavior, everything has been studied by itself or in an isolated way. the leaders recognize the importance of transforming the culture, and which define the military structures. The misbehaviors, systemic misbehaviors, and the ethic behaviors lived by the members of the defense. We have asked to our member to have to some synthesis, and the ones are to put to the light at the level of the culture and the experiences lived by the members. So there are quantitative there's yes, il y a aussi very little research done. So there are some studies that on a paradigm, like we can see here, the studies of the l'équipe of the defense of we see the defense studies, but less on the way of they are being lived. So the way they are being lived, or the incidents systemic, which affect the women less than the capacities of the general public, sorry, members. So we do the big we have, in order to understand and supervise, we have to understand the subcultures, the mechanism. We have to understand what's being done underline. We have to put the socio-cultural leading to the systemic misbehaviors. And the objective of the presentation is to bring light to the importance of the research or regarding the lived experiences of the members of the defense forces, promote and employ a perspective, a practice of anti-oppressive. So the experience, lived experience, personal experience, there is a point which is we have to explore in order to understand between the individuals and the environment, social environment, and the structural, the systems of the oppression and the composites of the organizational culture. We have to explore the experiences lived by the totality of the members, the small minorities, the marginalized people. Then we have to prioritize the intersectional analysis and the inequality complexes. The tool is to use in order to do an experience where you can understand the inegalities and to have the different systems of. So we're trying to go way over of the phenomena and experience, and based on the lived personal experiences of the members. So we have to do by the ethnicity, we have to do by everybody's, that will help us to understand better everybody's behavior.
Next slide, please. Donc, explorer l'expérience vécue des membres de la défense peut nous aider.
In order to explain the experience lived by the members,
vécue propose une
manière. Here are the experiences, the structural, the holistic way, which the way they are interrelated to the environment. So we use the socio-ecological structure model. There is a complex way. There's interpersonal, There is the systemic. There is also the social, the way it is interconnected and experienced by the political aspects. So the first level would be, we can see it's more the individual action, where you can have the personal experiences, the exclusive experiences, the intersectional approaches. You can have the gender, the capacities, the sexuality. So there are individual, I'm suggesting some different dimensions. I'm just suggesting some, but there's a lot more. The second dimension is the one interpersonal. The groups, the interaction between your colleagues, the supervisors. Third level is the political ones, which are taken for normal.
La dernière couche, on parle ici des systèmes unifiés hégémoniques d'oppression, discriminatoire.
And the last one is the discriminatory one. It's a
contexte social et historique de l'organisation. Next slide, please. OK, donc cette diapo présente des thèmes de recherche importants en lien avec l'expérience vécue qui ont été identifiés par...
This slide shows how to understand. You can see it in more detail.
Des gens qui sont impliqués dans les programmes, dans les politiques, dans les stratégies au sein de l'organisation.
Alors, the important theme is for research is are the systemic limits and which shows the experiences of the different people, the racial systems, the women, different cultures, and the groups that we don't know still, the systemic ways of acting. The second theme is the second one would be is the risks. Another theme is the mechanism and the changes. It's going to be the differences we have for the resistance to change and how that affects the general one.
Vraiment mettre au défi la manière dont on a fait la recherche dans le passé sur la conduite et la culture.
Likewise, the different ones for the cultures, there are more approaches that are more innovative in order to make sure that we're able to consult. So, in order to be respectful, in order to include the defense members to the discussions connected to the research. Prochain diapo.
En ce qui concerne les approches de recherche et les principes.
Concerning the approaches of the perspective of anti-oppressive, it's from Dominelli. We under here that the development of the conscious critic and the critic conscience and the changes, structural changes or social of the individual, that's gonna direct to the respects of the power relations, the defense of the rights and liberties and the social justice, the constant auto-reflection critics, and the different social theories is the different approaches, intersectional, decolonial, the theory of the races, the feminist, the anti-racist, and different queer of color critics. We are building the different research programs, structural sources, and the oppression of oriented the frame of analysis of the studies, addressing the hegemonic systems. it's we should understand better the organization, the military organization, how the military organization maintains the inequalities, social inequalities, which are quite complex, but connected to identity of the sexes, the race, the classes, and transform the culture.
Next slide, please. En ce qui concerne les approches méthodologiques,
what concerns the methodological approaches adapted to the complexity of this phenomenon. Yeah, we recognize a social inequality and the method centered on the production of knowledge based on the experience lived by people who are marginalized in order to bring changes which are permanent and they have a meaning for them.
De se détacher des modèles dominants de la recherche qui privilégient la neutralité du chercheur ou de la chercheuse.
We have to privilege the neutrality of the researcher and enable to be able to discuss and leave them respect them. We should need to position ourselves on the side of the marginalized persons. We have to question the status quo in a way that to re-equilibrate the split.
Donc, compte tenu de la complexité du phénomène à l'étude, notamment d'adapter les méthodologies de recherche afin de répondre aux objectifs. Donc, on explore différentes pratiques. Donc, l'approche...
There are different approaches, like the research questions. They have to be used by methodological a method which is eclectic, flexible, and go towards the plurality of the approaches. It has to be interdisciplinary, multi-methodical, and multimodal. It has to be used, you have to use all the materials, all the sources, and we have to go further, deeper, in order to find out what's really connected to the culture. We have to favorize an approach, analytical approach, which is adapted to the objectives of the research, contrarily to the use of a patron or a gabarit, the rigid research. The method will allow the analysis complete of the phenomenon and can palliate the limits and optimize the forces of the methodologies. In order to conclude, it's order to better understand the systemic and institutional systemic historical approaches of all the members of the defense members. We have to, and in order to understand the organizational culture and to have success in the new level of the culture, we have to define the traditional approaches and be able to question them on the way of quantitative and qualitative. And we have to also appreciate and question the methods. It's all for me. Thank you very much.
Okay, so this brings us to our question and answer period for our first panel. I guess, Melissa, maybe you would monitor the chat, I suppose, for those questions. Yeah. So maybe we'll start with those of us who are in the room here. Any questions for any of our panelists? Leona.
Yeah, just for Isabelle and Ash, thank you so much for those presentations and doing research on those really important topics for the CAT. I'm wondering at your level, after doing such extensive research and adding to the discourse on this topic, when you present this, the findings to the GoFos or people you're working with at CPCC, are you being met with open arms to operationalize some of this? And what kind of exciting initiatives can we expect at the tactical level based on everything you guys have researched?
Were you able to hear that? Oh,
Yes, so it's the response, the organization's response to the research or these concepts. So from my experience, depending on the content or the wording of these concepts, sometimes there is resistance to the concepts that are important to understand culture, but overall there is a strong motivation to be successful in related to culture evolution, and they are integrating more and more of our work. The practitioners, they are really interested in the research. It's sometimes we need to build a bridge between the researchers and the practitioners. and really that's where we meet challenge sometimes. It's how to translate this information in a way that it will be received and it's to provide recommendations that are actionable, right? Like that the leadership, they know what to do with their recommendations. So I'm not sure this is answering your question, but overall, there is strong interest in the research. They really want to be evidence-based. So I'm working on with the group that is in charge of the cultural evolution framework for the organization, and we're doing our best to provide recommendations that will be well received by the leaders and the organization. But so yeah, sometimes some of the concepts perhaps are hard to grasp, or there's perhaps it's a little bit conflicting. Like it's challenging for some members to play with these new ideas. Yeah, that's my take on it.
I could speak to it like very minimally. The question, I think, just because I know Isabelle has a lot more experience presenting this work, actually sort of to leadership in terms of the CAF. I mostly work with the Transforming Military Cultures Network, which is a Minds funded network. And I can say that we just had our 1-year symposium where we had many sort of like people who are doing military research. We had current CAF members, we had retired veterans. We had like a large sort of group of varying sort of roles. And I think in that space, although I didn't present this research, there were a lot of conversations that revolved around these topics. And I think that they were really generative. And like Isabelle is saying, I think that the desire is there, the awareness of like a need for cultural evolution, culture change. I think it's all there. In terms of leadership, especially, it's just, again, like Isabelle is saying, it's distilling this like really academic research in a way that is accessible and translatable and makes sense in practice. And that is, that I think is the goal at this point.
Excellent. Other questions? Sure.
Super. I have a question, Haval, if I may. So this might not have been too much within your research, but did you find that there were many children who were changing their affiliation of the jihadist group to which they belonged as those groups either were defeated or collapsed for whatever reason? And secondly, in terms of the community building in the de-radicalization, how important is it that the individuals, whether they're moderate, who are going to be doing that de-radicalization program, come from the same community as them? So, for example, could the people who are working in those camps then be moved to work with former Al-Shabaab jihadists and so on, or is it more localized than that?
Well, great question, thank you. The first question, yes, we have seen that Hughes in particular who were active participant with Muslim fronts before the establishment of ISIS. After ISIS decided to break away from the Muslim fronts, they switched sides basically. ISIS played more of the narratives that were more extremist, and for ISIS declared bullshit. Their focus stayed in Syria. They're portrayed strongly against the Syrian regime within an extreme context, of course. But those youth who actually were having perceived grievances against everyone else, not only against the Syrian regime, they switched slightly from Al-Nusra to ISIS, who in no time had control. And also, the incentives played a role in that as well. ISIS portrayed or provided more status, right? Whether it's money, guns, sex, power, right? That also served as an incentive for to switch the insights. As to the next question, it's extremely important to have Islamic religious leaders from the exact same communities because they tend to be more they tend to be perceived with more legitimacy by the members. Having an external, the rich are not the same. They have to bring other religious leaders from different communities, from different cities, and they're completely rejected within the community burning out example, right? Because they don't trust them. They perceived to be selected by certain security agencies to be spying on them, like intelligence, and also they don't unfortunately know about those struggles. So having someone, whether it's a religious leader or leader from the same community, is extremely important because we find they tend to be more acceptable. In Calgary, again, we're going to example Calgary here, redirectable. We have this part. The person that they are partnering with is well respected among in Calgary. Therefore, he's very well accepted among young people.
There's a question online from Carl Kathy Blue. Kathy, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I've unmuted myself. Mon question est pour Isabelle et aussi for Ash. In your response to the last question, you talked about bridging the gap. And I think that's my question is how best to operationalize that research, that vast body of research that we have that's growing, how best to operationalize that for our members within the CAF. How do we do that? And how do we build that bridge? What are your suggestions in that field?
I can attempt an answer. So I'm working right now on research integration on conduct and culture, really focusing on the recommendation. So synthesizing, trying to, and it, as you mentioned, it's a large body of knowledge. There's a lot of research that has been done in the past 20 years. So I'm working with my colleagues who are the experts in the organization, and we are in the process of creating synthesis on different themes related to conduct and culture, and provide very actionable actionable recommendation. And that's the challenge. It's in the past, I think our recommendations were really focused on, okay, what was missing from this research? But now we want to move forward and focus on what evidence from internal research and external research, what is our best recommendations for leadership. And so I will engage L1s, the leaders from like operational elements, so like Army and Navy, Air Force, to better understand their perspective, like what is the best format, like how can we do that. So really, again, we're trying to challenge our practices to engage at another level instead of producing our research, putting together a report, sending the report, that's the going a step further and really engaging the people who will use the research to make sure it's well understood and they are capable of making decisions, developing programs, strategies, policies based on the information. But it's so it's a big task. I'm doing my best on it.
Je sais, merci beaucoup.
Yeah, and I guess just to quickly add, I think building on what Isabelle was saying, the need is really there for collaboration and for sort of like different levels of integration of the research, I would say, because there are, this question comes up all the time in the work that the Transforming Military Cultures Network is doing. They're like, what culture? Because there are many different cultures. There are so many different cultures within the Canadian Armed Forces. So I think that there's places and spaces for many different forms of this sort of like work to be done. And it really needs to be collaborative between people doing research and people working on equity and working on culture change, and then actual people on the ground. There needs to be those partnerships and discussions and learning together.
Thank you, Ash.
And we have a question from Rachel next, Rachel Wallace.
Okay, so this question is for Ash. You made mention of building a community of safety and belonging. In your opinion, how does it look like and how will it be transmitted?
I think that's a really good question. I think, unfortunately, that there isn't a straightforward answer because communities like that look different depending on the context. I think that there are those sort of basic principles that I mentioned, where individuals need to feel a sense of belonging, and along with that belonging and along with the purpose, because I think belonging and purpose are two things that the military culture does quite well. But along with those things, there needs to also be a sense of safety and dignity. And I think that those two pieces are areas where work needs to be done. Could you repeat the second part of your question?
Oh, so I said, how will it be transmitted?
Okay, yeah. And I think that sort of thinking about how we can have, like, if we're thinking about how to make individuals feel held in community, feel like their dignity is being supported and they are safe. I think asking, beginning with those individuals and asking them how they can feel that way is important. But then also just sort of conveying a general message that like people are okay to bring difference into a space, and that not all of that difference needs to be subjugated or erased in order to serve a greater purpose. I think valuing individuals for their differences and looking at how those differences can actually be leveraged in order to support the work that's being done is quite valuable as well. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Do you have any other questions in the in-person audience? Any questions for Mohammed, our first speaker? He's not online anymore, but never mind. Never mind. Any other questions? Comments? Questions that are more of a comment? Online? Any online folks with questions? All right, well then I think we can all join me in thanking our panelists. They did an excellent job, and thank you so much to the audience members for your fantastic questions. Thank you. We will have a relatively short, well, not medium-ish sized comfort break, shall we say. We come back at 2:30 in Mountain Time, 4:30 Eastern Time. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you shortly. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We'll commence now with panel 2 of our CDSN Capstone. I'll introduce to you, as I did last time, all of the participants, and then we'll have them present their research, followed by a question and answer session. Our first presenter is Ryan Dean, currently at Trent University. His paper is called Functional Actors in Canadian Defense and Security Policy, Lessons from the Arctic. I'm going to introduce everybody. Hang on for a second. Lessons from the Arctic, 1985 to 2010. Ryan Dean is a Madsen postdoctoral fellow and policy research coordinator. He received his PhD here in political science at the University of Calgary in 2022. His research focuses on Arctic policy and issues of sovereignty and security. His recent edited volumes include Shielding North America, Canada's Role in NORAD Modernization from 2021, Reconceptualizing Arctic Security, selected articles from the Journal of Military and Security Studies, which is published through CMSS, by the way, co-edited in 2017, and Canada's Northern Strategy under the Harper Conservatives, Key Speeches and Documents on Sovereignty, Security, and Governance, 2006 to 2015, co-authored in 2016. Our second presenter will be Thomas Hughes, currently at the University of Manitoba. His paper is entitled Cold Comfort, Threat Perception, and Confidence Building in Europe and the Arctic. Thomas Hughes is a postdoctoral student at the University of Manitoba, as I mentioned, and the 2022 CDSN doctoral fellow, having received his PhD from Queen's University in August 2021. His primary areas of research are in confidence building, deterrence, and strategic culture, and his award-winning dissertation focusing on how military exercises have been used to shape the political and security environment in Europe since 1975. His current research focus is on Arctic defense and security. Our presenter after that, our third presenter is, right part of my screen here, is Nicholas Gillespie. He is currently at the University of Manitoba. His paper is entitled The Canada-US Permanent Joint Board on Defense, Legacy and Relevancy in the 21st Century. Nicholas is an MA candidate in the Department of Political Studies at the university there. He is a research fellow at the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network and student fellow and research assistant at the Center for Defense and Security Studies. His interests include Canada-US relations, Arctic security, and military history. He holds the 2022-2023 CDSM, 2021 to 2023 Duff Rodlin Fellowship in Canadian and Manitoba Government and Politics, the Paul Toll Fellowship, and the 2022 Murray and Muriel Smith Scholarship. And last, but certainly not least, our final presenter of the day is Fiona Ahmad. Her presentation will be on women, peace and security, military application, and beyond. Leona resides north of here in Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton, Alberta, and is a human security advocate, a senior military officer in the Canadian Armed Forces, and graduate of the Masters of Human Security and Peacebuilding program at Royal Roads University. Leona is passionate about contributing to a more just and inclusive society by building community and by advancing the rights of LGBTQ+ women and racialized peoples. Of Korean heritage, Leona is actively committed to anti-racist practices and infuses the transformational beauties of Western and Eastern cultures into her leadership. Leona has deployed on domestic and expeditionary operations, ranging from support for Vancouver 2010 Olympics, Podium, I love that name, that's a great operation name. Leading the logistics program for flood relief operations within Canada, Lentis, and leading platoons or units in Afghanistan, Operation Athena, and Latvia, Operation Reassurance. With that, I turn it over to Brian Lee.
Okay, thank you to the Defense and Security Network and Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies for having me to present. Thank you, Mary Anderson and Melissa Jennings for organizing this wonderful event. I'm Ryan Dean, the North American Arctic Defense and Security Network's postdoctoral fellow and policy and research coordinator. My recent dissertation engaged with functional actors, and I will be talking about what they are, what they do, and how they influence security policy in the Arctic. I think this is good to be aware of them and how they can affect Canadian security policy writ large now and into the future. So what led me to study functional actors? When I finished my master's, I got a job at the Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation as a policy analyst with their Arctic security program that they were running with Monk School at the University of Toronto. And I quickly came to see that domestic actors had been important in shaping the Arctic through Canada and continue to be so. I noticed that these domestic actors were always working in notions of security into their policy prescriptions. So security seeped into everything. Policies always had the S word attached to them. And these different notions of security were all over the theoretical. And it was hard for me to put them in dialogue with one another. I tried talking to different actors and they could tell you what they wanted to do, but really struggled to engage with other ideas. They sort of talked past each other rather than to each other. Or they would say that such a threat mattered, but it was not as pressing as the threat they wanted to address. Lastly, these domestic actors had their own bailiwicks. They wanted to change things to suit particular interests, but few, if any, spoke of putting together a comprehensive policy. So what is the problem? I went to the secondary literature looking for answers, but I could not find anything that provided a coherent explanation of the development of Canadian Arctic security, how these actors fit within it. When my program wrapped up, I wanted to undertake a PhD and write a dissertation that contributed to the scholarship by placing the development of Canadian Arctic security policy into a coherent, systemic, and longitudinal study, something I never saw done here. I wanted to address this gap in literature. I sought to explain why Canada would do something in the Arctic and how it was domestic actors within the state that shaped something. I decided to apply second-generation securitization theory to get these answers. The more I read about securitization theory and the various actors involved in the case studies in my dissertation, I realized that they fit the role of the under-theorized functional actor. Second-generation securitization theory explains how Canadian Arctic security developed from 1985, when we didn't have a policy, to 2010, when we finished our first comprehensive. So, perfect. So what is securitization? Securitization theory initially was developed by the Copenhagen School to explore how actors perceived and enacted security. Securitization consists of three actors. Anyways, those three actors. The first is known as a securitizing actor, and that is political elites that must be formally or institutionally and morally legitimate to the audience. The audience is the second actor. They must be targeted by the securitizing actor and have a direct causal link with initiative. And the ability to enable said securitizing actor to adopt an extraordinary measure to address the proposal. Most work on securitization theory has looked at these two actors and how they interact. However, last and least in the literature is the theoretically neglected functional actor, who does not have political power, but does affect the dynamics of securitization. So securitization theory works through a three-step process known as a securitizing move. The first step is the presentation of an issue by a securitizing actor as an existential threat to a targeted audience. Second, an argument is made by the securitizing actor to the audience that this threat constitutes an emergency that demands immediate attention to do something. Thirdly, an extraordinary response is legitimized or rejected by an audience to move the threat beyond the boundary of normal politics. This process of speaking security introduces criteria about what is not a security issue, what the issue is, and who is involved. So from the theoretical to the practical, securitization is a process of populating and ordering policy agendas. Securitizing an issue makes it a threat that effectively jumps the queue beyond normal politics to the top of the security agenda. Desecuritizing a threat makes it a non-issue, taking it off the policy agenda altogether. Slide please. The securitization process introduces theoretical complexity that can easily overwhelm and derail analysis. I applied sectors of security to map out securitizing ways across the breadth of analysis to help manage this complexity. The sectors of security were developed by the Copenhagen School to explain who can do security and do what. The what are referred objects, that what is to be protected. For example, the military sector is focused on the territorial integrity of the state, while societal security deals with relationships of collective identity. The use of sectors of security place theoretical markers to guide my analysis. So second generation securitization shifts the focus of the earlier Copenhagen School from speaking security to the context in which speech acts are made. It allows for the setting of the stage on which securitizing moves are presented. This context is established through the longitudinal study of a series of case studies, each one setting up the following, the when of the analysis. I gave special attention to functional actors and how they shape the context in which securitizing actors and audience interact. Though under theorized in the literature, these actors introduce the why to telling the story of these case studies. This theoretical posture offers a flexible approach to analyzing the development of Arctic security policy. First, securitization theory allows for the interrogation of a diverse range of actors involved in the formulating broad forms of security beyond military threats at, above, and below a traditional state-centric perspective. Second generation securitization theory allows for the mapping of a series of events, facilitating a longitudinal analysis of Canadian Arctic security. This is important as each case study informs the next demonstrating change over time. So slide please. Okay, functional actor case studies. I think we'll look at 5 case studies over the course of my dissertation, placing different people and institutions in the role of functional actor and seeing how they affect the securitization process. Today, I'd like to talk about the first 3 before making some general conclusions about functional actors in their role in Canadian defense and security policy. My first case study was the 1985 voyage of the United States Coast Guard icebreaker Folder 3 through the Northwest Passage. Here I placed political science professor Franklin Griffiths in the role of the functional actor. Through a short series of opinion pieces, Griffiths would influence the security dynamic by drawing the attention of Canadians to the voyage of the Polar Sea. He wrote a Globe and Mail opinion piece that laid out a prescription for the government for how it should respond and caused public outrage, shaming them to action to do so. Griffiths wanted an agreement with the United States to allow their icebreakers to transit the passage in a way that would not compromise our legal positions. For Canada to enclose its disputed waters with straight baselines, and 3, that Canada should require a year-round icebreaker capability. Now, 2 cabinet ministers assumed the role of securitizing actor, one successful and one not. The then Minister of Foreign Affairs Joe Clark worked within the context set out by Griffiths, enclosing the waters of the Arctic archipelago, and then undertaking the extraordinary move to secure American acceptance of an icebreaker. In this, he convinced both a Canadian and an American audience. He provided a political sector solution to a political sector threat to sovereignty. In contrast, then Minister Eric Nielsen tried to harness the event to justify buying nuclear powered attack submarines. He told Canadians this was a military sector solution to the political sector threat to sovereignty. However, he then told his American audience it was a military sector solution to the threat posed by the Soviets. This messaging led to confusion. Additionally, the submarines were very much outside the context established by Griffiths, leading to failure. So, context matters. Functional actors are important in establishing this context, important when we think of replacing our submarines and icebreakers today. Clark was successful because his move was made within the context shaped by the functional actor. In contrast, Nielsen's failed because it was not. The second observation coming from this case is that there's more than one audience. Both actors had as their audience the Canadian public and officials in Ottawa. Clark's message was also consistent with both audiences that he was appealing to. Neither audience was confused. Nielsen had applied a mixed messaging strategy, telling Canadians one thing and Washington another, leading to confusion, and this message did not resonate with Canadians. My second case study looked at the Canadian response to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's 1987 Vermont speech. It's significant because it broke from the Soviet tradition of pursuing bilateral engagement in the Arctic to regional solutions. A slew of Arctic regional thinking previously suppressed by Soviet policy exploded onto the policy agenda. Canada should do something. Much of this thinking came from Canadian NGOs who assumed the role of functional actors. 4 NGOs published reports shaping proactive Canadian policy to establish what would become the Arctic Council. The Inuit Circumpolar Council, the National Capital Branch of the Canadian Institute of International Affairs, the Canadian Centre for Arms Control and Disarmament, and the Arctic Council panel offered 3 policy prescriptions for developing a region. 1, a societal sector security mandate for meaningful Indigenous participation. 2, an environmental sector of security mandate for sustainable development. And 3, a political sector of security mandate to demilitarize the Arctic. The first sought to bring civility to the Arctic through normative behavior, something Professor Hiebert was talking about earlier this morning, and this is the notion of Arctic stewardship. The third sought to directly demilitarize the Arctic through regional arms control, something Dr. Hughes will be talking about. The notion of Arctic exceptionalism. All 4 NGO reports embraced the first 2 of these recommendations, but only one, the CCACD report, called for the direct demilitarization of Arctic. The problem with the regional demilitarization proposal is that the bulk of the Soviet nuclear deterrent was stationed in the Arctic. This arsenal had a global, not regional impact, and the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, now DAC, concluded it was therefore must be addressed with an international and not from a regional perspective. When in 1990, DFAID assumed the role of securitizing actor, it went for an Arctic regime built on Indigenous participation and sustainable development. Now, the Ottawa Declaration was signed in 1996. For 6 years, DFAID worked to convince its audience and the other 7 Arctic states to create an Arctic Council. The toughest critic was the US State Department, but agreement was eventually reached. These functional actors had proactively populated and supported this policy agenda in advance of any action by DFAID in its role as a securitizing actor. To put it another way, the policy train was crafted and mapped out by the functional actors. From this perspective, functional actors can shape the securitizing move. It indicates a relationship between functional and securitizing actors beyond the context provided in my previous case study. And when examining the 3 prescriptions of functional actors, Arctic exceptionalism for regional arms control measures is the only one to directly contradict consistent government policy. This suggests that if a functional actor does this, it lessens the chance of its overall policy and prescription being picked up by a securitizing actor. Lastly, by tracing the securitization that led to the Arctic Council over time, it demonstrates that a securitizing move was an iterative process. Less a speech act and more a conversation between securitizing actor and audience. This dialogue between actors was able to continue over rounds of negotiations lasting for years. Both the securitizing actor and audiences were able to socialize their notions of Indigenous participation and sustainable development with each other before they reached a shared understanding. Slide, please. Now, the activists' drive to place an Arctic Council on the agenda also showed that security policy could be accessible to Canadians outside of government. The House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Trade decided to undertake an in-depth study of the Arctic and into other circumpolar issues in the mid-1990s, which resulted in the report Canada and the Circumpolar World Meeting the Challenges of Cooperation in the 21st Century, which later informed policy. This case examined the committee and the role of a functional actor. This includes its interaction with Northerners, NGOs, businesses, and academics. Functional actors from earlier case studies. The committee was very much informed by the contemporary policy debate exemplified by the 1994 Canada's Foreign Policy and the UNDP report expounding the human security focus, and the conference and Northern Foreign Policy for Canada, pushing for more Arctic stewardship to continue to dominate policy into the future. The committee adopted these prescriptions and amplified them through its witness selection process. Much of the evidence provided is fixated on the environmental and societal sectors of security, particularly from the perspective of the individual community level. This testimony demonstrates the report and the recommendations it made. The major conclusion about this case is that the parliamentary committee as a functional actor was inherently a process of politicization rather than securitization. It used securitization as a method. The committee was not making an external or an emergency response to an existential threat. When framing security, the committee as a functional actor presented its findings in politicized and not securitized language. It moderated securitizing language and testimony from witnesses. The subtext of the report was that the Christian liberals were handling Arctic policy through the creation of the Arctic Council and were proactively studying certain polar problems towards the creation of a new Arctic security policy, all to be handled within the bounds of normal politics. The committee was very much a part of this normal political process. So, conclusions. My research found that the functional actor, those who affect the securitization process but do not hold political power, plays a key role in the creation of a comprehensive Arctic policy. The various stakeholders who undertook or who took on the role of the functional actor were essential in generating options for securitizing actors to seize on and present the securitizing moves. The securitizations that led to Canada's comprehensive Arctic security policy were not a distinct set of occurrences. These securitizations were a process with each move providing context for those that followed. It was through this iterative process that conceptualizations of Canadian Arctic security broadened and deepened, becoming increasingly complex articulations of security reflecting policy. The context within which securitizing moves were made matters. So one, my dissertation shows a lot of increasingly complex movement between the sectors of security. Things start off very simple with the first successful desecuritization, the Arctic Cooperation Agreement from Minister Clark. Similar to that 1-2 interaction between military sector solutions for political threats were also very simple. When policy shifts from being reactive to being proactive, the complexity of the interaction between the sectors of security explodes. Things expand from the traditional strategic studies focused on sovereignty and defense to the broad and deep understandings of security across the sectors of analysis. Stewardship, or politically emancipating Indigenous Northerners to societal and environmental security while using norms of civility to push the military sector off the agenda, is a very complex articulation. You would think that as policy matured, there'd be less space for these expansive articulations of security. However, the case studies demonstrate a pattern of increasing sophisticated understandings and articulations of security that were reflected in policy. Two, I also found a tendency towards politicization rather than securitization. That is, it's about the formulation of policy within the realm of normal politics, but using securitization as a methodology. The literature makes clear, and my dissertation supports, the notion that a securitization is a sort of policy anomaly. A threat does not stay securitized. There's an impulse for securitized threats in this agitated state to slide back into the political process. When looking at policy through a securitizing lens, I suggest it's advantageous for opposition parties to undertake a securitizing move during an election to generate public interest, as it accuses the government of being unable to address the threat. It makes them look incompetent. However, the political advantage of employing securitization as a strategy is different for governments. A securitizing move essentially tells constituents that the government is failing to address a problem within the bounds of the politics. Alleging such a vulnerability is neither within the country's interest nor a government's political interest to do so. Conversely, governments gain advantage by avoiding securitizing rhetoric and operating within the bounds of politics, broadcasting the appearance of managing threats and providing greater security. 3, context matters. Functional actors were critical in preparing the intersubjective terrain, the context in which moves were made. Securitizing moves made within context succeeded, while those that did not failed. Functional actors essentially act as the contextual glue, connecting the securitizing actor to their audience. Functional actors provide policy options for those with power to securitize in government policy. Clark's Icebreaker Agreement, DFAKE's Arctic Council, or the Parliamentary Committee all demonstrate that securitizing moves made within the context of the time succeeded. Conversely, Nielsen's nuclear-powered attack submarine fleet failed. Securitizing moves made within context are likely to succeed, while those out of context are likely to fail. So what? The research contributes to a knowledge of security policy by charting what has made it onto or off of the agenda, and therefore different notions of security rank compared to one another through coherent, systematic, and longitudinal study using second-generation securitization theory. I think this research is important because we should have more explanations of what happens when actors call upon states to do something. We should be better aware of who's influencing security policy in the Arctic and elsewhere and how they're going about that. Thank you very much. And sorry I ran a bit.
I'm going to test the owl and see how well it can follow me with beady eye around the room. Wonderful. Well, it's a real pleasure to be able to speak at events like this. I absolutely love coming to these sorts of things where people present different stuff to what I usually hear. And it becomes very clear that there are an awful lot of topics about which I know absolutely nothing, but really cool people are doing really cool stuff on. So it's a huge privilege to be here and part of that. And always thank you to CDSN for inviting us. Okay, fair enough. Okay, challenge me down. Slightly different focus to the title. So what I wanted to do for this presentation is talk a little bit about a subject that you're really excited, called confidence building. This is a arms control regime, positive arms control regime, which takes us away from the current or the primary understanding of arms control about limiting what people can do, but instead changes or at least attempts to change our understanding of intent. The arms control regime of confidence building measures was really the subject of my dissertation. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to tell you a little bit about confidence building measures. They were big in the 80s, but there are not very many of us in the room who were around at that point, so I think it's worth mentioning. I'll talk a little bit about the theoretical challenges that I think exist within confidence building, because that sets the framework for the next part, which is really the results of my PhD, and looking at threat perception in Europe. And what is it that actually makes European actors feel threatened or feel like they are being threatened? Then I'll move on to the Arctic and finish off with the fun stuff that's coming after that. So, start with confidence building. The idea of confidence building is premised on the concept that wars start because potentially somebody gets the wrong end of the stick, to put it colloquially. The idea here is that wars will commence through misunderstanding, misperception. People will believe that they're actually under threat when that is not the case. And because of that, they end up launching a preemptive strike. A classic in this is military exercise. So in 1975, the first set of confidence building measures, Helsinki Accords, focused very strongly on military exercise because there was this real concern that somebody would run an exercise and the other side would see that and think, oh, crikey, that's the first stage of an invasion, launch a preemptive strike, and suddenly, before you know it, we've got World War III, when neither side genuinely wanted or even expected that to happen. And so this would come about by increasing transparency and openness. Because if we're more open and transparent about what we're doing, then the other side will notice, as Holst and Melander said in 77, the absence of fear threat. So the things that they're worried about, if we're open and transparent, we'll show them that they actually have no need to be worried about that at all. So that's pretty short term when it comes to that preemptive strike and exercise. But James Goodby, who was the lead negotiator with the US in the next iteration of this in Stockholm in 1986, also suggested that the idea of this regime was that by being open and transparent, you create this habit of cooperation. You continue to discuss issues with each other, you're very open, and that provides the first step to a positive relationship where these confidence building measures are needed anymore. So that's the concept. As I said, the Helsinki Accords, 1975, relatively straightforward. Quite simple. If you're going to run a military exercise with over 25,000 troops, relatively close to a border, you've got to tell everyone 3 weeks in advance, just so that they don't think that you're doing something nefarious. The next iteration of this came in 1986. The Stockholm document, was basically the same. But what was interesting here, and this refers to the brackets in the title, is that they changed the name. And they changed it from confidence building measures to confidence and security building measures. And that's important, so keep that one in mind. So Stockholm basically does the same thing. If you've got 13,000 troops within a certain distance, certain border, tell everyone that you're going to run an exercise 42 days in advance. But crucially here, if you run an exercise over 17,000 troops, you've got to invite other people to come and watch and essentially give them unfettered access. Just get to see what you're up to. The other documents essentially just evolved this concept. all fairly similar. Now the latest iteration, this 2011, 9,000 troops to notify, 13,000 troops to invite observers. What's interesting about the 13,000 figure, you might notice that whenever Russia runs a really large exercise, they've always got 12,700 or 12,900, and the reason for that is that they can then say, you can't come and watch. But actually, we will invite you to come and watch because we're nice like that, but because it's not under the terms of this agreement, you can't just say, I would like to go and see that bit of the exercise, please, and then go. They've got no ready control. That's a slide the same. So, next slide. So this is all very well in theory. There are, I think, some challenges. The first problem is that the terms of these agreements were all negotiated. I gave you the top levels of those agreements, but essentially both parties went in saying, this is what we want to see in order to be confident that you are not going to do the nasty thing that we're scared of you doing. And both sides said, well, we're not comfortable giving you that degree of information. And of course, what that means is neither side actually had sufficient information to make me confident in the benign intent of the other, which is a real problem given that that was the function of the regime. And just as a little aside on culture here as well, I absolutely love this comment from the General Accounting Office, US General Accounting Office in '88, 2 years after Stockholm negotiations, saying that there was a macho streak when we went into those. And I think as a function of arms control, that's probably not particularly helpful. There we are. Alongside that as well, you had this quote from North Atlantic Military Committee, 1980, saying that the regime should enhance the security in a tangible way. Again, the problem here is it's become opposition. You're using this regime to enhance your security against, in this case, the Soviet Union. And to be clear, the Soviets were doing exactly the same thing on the other side. And it resulted in a series of terms that were deliberately designed to try and negate the advantage that the other side gets from seeing what you're doing. Great example of this, naval exercises. When the regime was being negotiated in the 1980s, NATO's big concern was getting ships across the North Atlantic. Soviets really wanted to see how NATO did convoy defense. NATO obviously didn't want to do that and absolutely refused to include naval exercises in the conflict. They were just not going to be open about this. Wasn't part of the agreement. Fast forward to the 2010s, NATO is saying to Russia, we're really upset with what you're doing with the Black Sea Fleet. We want to see what you're up to. And they go, really? You wouldn't let us do it a few years ago. So, no. Similarly, no notice exercise, snap exercises, where they don't give any notification. NATO were desperate to keep them out of the agreement. Now, Russia does them, and NATO is saying, we're uncomfortable with this. And you should have told us before, because we wouldn't change. So, as you can see, the regime ends up being oppositional, confrontational, not quite giving the information that's particularly helpful, and also very much premised on the environment at the time. So, next slide, please. The key question, no, that's fine. The key question, though, is this one. Because we all talk about confidence building measures, but what are we actually trying to build confidence in? And this is where I think it gets fascinating. Because, as I said with the Helsinki Accords in 1975, we're trying to determine the intent of the other side. We're trying to determine whether they want to bash us in the short term. Yeah? That was about what is that exercise doing? That then started to be extended slightly, because the idea is that through that continuation of the terms, that continuation of openness, we would determine what your intent is in the medium term. So not just what you're going to do with this exercise, but what are you going to do in the next 5 years? Are you trying to develop the ability to defeat us or not? But once this started to become oppositional, it was about building your confidence in your ability to defeat an adversary if you felt that you had to. So it's about capability here. And that brings some other problems, of course, because today's environment is not like 2011, so that the terms of the regime that were agreed in 2011 don't reflect the capability that can be leveraged today. So a 13,000 troops exercise observation, you could do significant damage with far fewer than 13,000 troops. But if your threshold is 13,000, you don't have a great deal of wiggle room there. So now next slide, there we go, lovely. So now we've got that framework set, I wanted to put this in the context of security in Europe in practical terms. And my dissertation was looking primarily at military exercises because they fell in this framework, because they fell in that sort of regime of the confidence building. So the key question is, why do exercises cause concern sometimes and not in others? And the answer to this was pleasingly counterintuitive. The big thing to start with is that size wasn't the issue. What one would expect is that it's the big military exercises when they're run close to your border, that looks scary. And sure, it does a little bit, but that wasn't the full answer. To get the full answer, we need to dive in a little bit more to strategic culture. So for I won't go into great depth for this, spent loads of time in NATO archives, lots of fun. I chatted to people in Brussels and Belarus and all sorts of different places. It was great. We got loads of fun quotes. Next slide. What I understood, however, was that the exercises that caused NATO most concern when Soviet Union and Russia did it was when it looked like they were breaking the rules. And this came back to how NATO understood the threat environment. When NATO felt like it was a situation that was structured, that was predictable, they were comfortable with it. It didn't necessarily matter how much stuff the other side had. We can probably balance that out. We can come up with strategy to defeat that. When the whole situation is uncertain and we don't know what's happening, that is a real problem for us. That's not how NATO does the terror. The Soviet Union and Russia, they were quite interested because I think they have a very different understanding of what deters. And for them, they kind of like the chaos a little bit. They like things to be messy because if it's messy, everyone's cautious. If everyone's cautious, the less likely if you're going to get that escalation. So, of course, they're then masking their exercises, thinking that that's part of the deterrent. NATO are doing what they think is absolutely aggressive by playing by the rules and being really open. And for the Soviet Union and Russia, their primary concern was creating that buffer around them and also maintaining the ability to invade Western Europe if they needed to. Never actually intended to do it, arguably, but they needed to have that ability to hold that sword of Damocles over NATO. So whenever NATO ran an exercise close to their borders, or particularly when they have an exercise with a lot of NATO members, that's a real concern for Russia because it demonstrates cohesion. So Noble Jump 2017, really small, I think 12 different countries. Russia was jumping up and down about this. Why, guys, not a lot of people, because you've got a lot of people taking part. The key takeaways that I think here is we need to have an awareness of different understandings of security. And by that, I don't mean, as Dr. Dean was talking about, securitization, Copenhagen school style. What I mean in this is simply in the defense terms, that different countries have different understandings of what it means to be secure. And that isn't simply a function of material characteristics and geography. And secondly, it's a classic, it's really difficult to maintain capability parity and also demonstrate that you're not going to be a problem for the opposition. Next slide. So we then look at this in the Arctic context. I think this is really interesting because when you talk to people about the likely route to conflict in the Arctic, misunderstanding, misperception seems to be quite high at the top of the list. So that means that I think there is potentially an opportunity for a confidence building regime which says, okay, we could reduce that potential. If that's what we're worried about, let's have a conversation about this. The conversation about whether or not the Arctic is a zone of peace still or not is, of course, contentious. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I think it's pretty fair to say that the prominence of military activity, if not the volume, is increasing quite significantly, which again plays into that misperception issue. Next clip. Thank you. So I think there are two key questions, and this is where I've kind of been trying to go a little bit over the past year. The first is how have efforts to enhance security affect the perception of threat faced by the other Arctic states? And to get a little bit more nuanced in that, things like what happens if NATO runs an anti-submarine exercise, Iceland, how have Russia responded to that? Do they respond differently to that than when the United States does a parachute drop in Alaska? And vice versa. How are we responding to different Russian activities, whether that's Norwegian response to a land-based exercise in Russia versus Canada or the US to long-range bomber exercise and things like that. So we need to build more nuance, I think, in understanding what threat looks like in the Arctic. And then also the openness and transparency issue. Are the states involved here reflecting their approach to openness and transparency in Europe? Or is Europe different? And if Europe is different, is it the fact that Europe's different, or is the Arctic exception? So, next question. So, the road ahead, hopefully continuing to help CDSN along its merry path. Primarily, I think there's a really useful piece of research that can be done, which is relatively simple, and it's just actually logging what is going on in the Arctic in terms of military activity, because the baseline data is not easily available. When you go and ask people about can you give me a list of the exercises that you've run in the Arctic in the last 3 years? Yeah, sure. Great. When can I have it? Oh, actually, we don't really have that. Why not? No, just don't have it. Come on, guys. This is the sort of thing that we need, even for answering questions like, is the Arctic becoming militarized? I mean, the conversation is happening without a great deal of absolute data about what it looks like. So, next click, please. Thank you. So just a bit of early findings. I won't go through them all in great detail, but I think we do see a high degree of openness in the Arctic than elsewhere. I love the absolute duality, the continued conversation saying the chances of military conflict in the Arctic is really vanishingly low. Don't worry about it. Can we have loads of millions of dollars so that we can continue to improve our Arctic capabilities, please? Hang on a second. Where do these two things come from? Lots of finger pointing around dual use infrastructure. China is developing dual use infrastructure. We're developing civilian infrastructure that could be also used for military activities, but that's not dual use. But the primary point in here is uncertainty. I think there's such growing uncertainty about what's happening in the Arctic. Everyone's a little bit on edge right now about it. We just simply don't know how the development is going to happen. And that's a real problem. Come back to Europe, how NATO does deterrence. It doesn't like the uncertainty. That's not NATO's deterrent. Next slide. And I've got a book workshop coming up. Keep an eye out for that. That is with CDSN on the 1st of May in Ottawa. And if you don't track that, please keep an eye on the New York Times bestseller list over the next 18 months of them. You'll see it on there. So I will finish that. Thank you very much indeed. And
Great. I will skip thank you. So that's pretty shocking.
Thank you.
So defense cooperation between, next slide, please. Defense cooperation between Canada and the US was limited, if not practically non-existent, for World War II. Military departments briefly discussed the One-Hoover Strait in 1938, and RTAP officer was posted to Washington in spring 1940, and staff talks in July 1940 were inconclusive. But beginning with the establishment of the Canadian legation in Washington in 1927, there was a slow rapprochement, which I largely attribute to 4 factors. 1, the personal diplomatic relationship between Mackenzie King and President Roosevelt. 2, geographic proximity, increasingly linked societies, cultures, and economies, especially with the 1935 Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. 3, increasing greater power competition in Europe and Asia threatening America. And 4, the rise of O.B. Skelton's North Americanism, centered on the idea that both countries are bound by economics, ideas, and interests. Next slide. So in 1938, during the Sudeten crisis in modern-day Czechoslovakia, Roosevelt made a remarkable pledge while receiving an honorary degree at Queen's University in Kingston. The United States would not stand idly by the domination of Canadian soil is threatened by any other empire. Caught off guard, Mackenzie King responded 2 days later that Canada has the obligations as a good and friendly neighbor that should the occasion ever arise, enemy forces should not be able to pursue their way either by land, sea, or air to the United States across Canadian territory. These statements, known as the Kingston Dispensation and the Canadian Corollary, led to the more expansive yet still informal Augsburg Agreement 2 years later. While campaigning for the presidency in upstate New York and during the height of Battle of Britain, Roosevelt asked King to join him on his train to discuss the matter of mutual defenses of our coast on the Atlantic. On the 18th of August, 1940, as a result of the joint press release, the Permanent Joint Board on Defense, or the PJB, was created. So the press release and Roosevelt and King's prior statements in 1938 is the underlying foundation of the Canada-US defense relationship, with an interesting conundrum. Formally, the two heads of government are declaring a mutual defense alliance, but it is informal in the sense that the agreement was never ratified in Congress or in Parliament. It was treated as an executive order in Washington and passed as an order in Council of Cabinet in Ottawa. Next slide. So King and Roosevelt agreed to the word board over commission or committee, because board did not suggest the need for formal government appointments. This is an example of the first American and Canadian PJB co-chairs. The American, Fiorello LaGuardia,
was a major backer of Roosevelt's New Deal, New York City, and a political friend of the president's. And Colonel Owen Biggar was the former Canadian Chief Electoral Officer and Judge Advocate General. The word permanent is important to unpack and cater to both domestic and political audiences. For Roosevelt, he was focusing on defense, because the US was neutral in the war. For King, permanency with the USA was a key tenet of showing to Washington that Canada is a good neighbor willing to pull its weight relative to the 1938 statements. And B meant that Canada increasingly recognized the peril of Great Britain. Canada's assistance by proxy for American security. All 4 Canadian naval destroyers and infantry units had already been sent to England. There are no capabilities left to defend Canada or Germany in the Atlantic or Japan in the Pacific, and this created a security vacuum for the US. Next slide. Immediately, the PJBD acted quickly, spurred by the extreme sense of urgency given the war. In its first 5 years, the board met 42 times and made 33 recommendations on sensitive issues: the defense of then British colony Newfoundland and the construction of the Alaska Highway. In the immediacy of the post-war period, however, the PJBD recommended the creation of the Military Cooperation Committee, or MCC, to focus on exclusively military issues in 1946. And in 1947, American civilian agencies like the White House National Security Council or the CIA were created by the National Security Act. These actions further reduced the amount of PJBD meetings. But in 1949, North American defense took on a new urgency. Russia had nuclear capabilities, the communist regime took control of China, and the Korean War began. So despite the thinning of its agenda, the board still studied, advised, and made recommendations on consequential issues, such as command and control arrangements for NORAD, which is recommendation 6, implementation of radar lines supporting NORAD's mission, the Pine Tree Line, recommendation 51, the Mid-Canada Line, the Dew Line, the 4.9 system. The construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway that began in 1954, recommendation 52, the Y2K bug in 2000, NORAD's 2006 and perpetuity agreement. The PJBD requested the evolution of NORAD study in the late 2010s. My favorite recommendation, though, is the standardization of screw threads between the US, Canada, and the UK in 1947. Next slide, please. So as a direct line of defense advice to the President and the Prime Minister, the PJBD benefits from discussing sensitive topics in a frank manner, away from media spotlight and away from public access. Because the civilian co-chairs are, in theory, handpicked by the heads of government, these choices provide signals as to how the agenda is viewed by each state at any given time. The PJBD has no executive or decision-making authority. It simply provides advice to the executive on mutual issues of continental defense. The current co-chairs report to the US Secretary of Defense, the Canadian Minister of National Defense. The Canadian is John Kay, the lawyer, longtime Liberal MP, who served on numerous parliamentary committees. The American is Melissa Dalton. She's the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and Hemispheric Affairs, a practitioner and a technocrat entrenched within the daily workings of the Pentagon. The board brings together permanent civilian, military, and security advisors from both sides of the border. Executive support is provided by TNT Paul and the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and International Security Affairs, who's also the pen for the National Security Strategy. Other representatives are included from the U.S. Canadian staffs, the State Department of Legal Affairs, Homeland Security and Public Safety, the National Security Council and Privy Council Office, embassy personnel, and appropriate expert witnesses relevant to the meeting's agenda. Next slide, please. So even with representatives from multiple government departments, the board has long suffered from an identity crisis, mostly due to the dominance of the MCC as a vice provider. And the end of the Cold War largely meant that continental defense was no longer a political priority for decision makers. In 2018, Andrea Sharon told the Senate Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development that the PJBD seems to need life support. But the geopolitical landscape has greatly changed since 1991. The return of great power politics, the annexation of Crimea and war in Ukraine, China is facing threat to American hegemony, advancements in weapons technology, climate change, COVID-19. There's a lot to discuss. A mistrust between Canada and the US as a result of Trump, but remaining differences under Biden still means there's lingering tension in the bilateral relationship. Biden's making his first trip to Canada later this week, the 18th. country of its presidency, whereas typically Canada was the first or the second, just like Mexico. But the PJBD is still suited to handle these sensitive issues that North America faces. The Augsburg Agreement states that the permanent joint board will consider in the broad sense the defense of the North half of the Western Hemisphere. Next slide, please. The geopolitical situation in 1949 may best resemble the times we find ourselves in. North American defense has assumed a new urgency. If new or updated institutions are needed to defend or solve these issues, I'm thinking of the Combined Disaster Relief Command or additional maritime component to NORAD's mission suite. The PJBD is a venue to pursue this, away from political spotlight, as defense objectives, technical problems, political, economic, and diplomatic objectives can be considered. And next slide, please. The 240th meeting of the PJBD was held in October 2020 in Ottawa, which was the first in-person meeting since 2019 due to COVID. McKay and Dalton, she's the second Biden co-chair, led discussions on NORAD modernization, climate change, and Arctic security, global and hemispheric security issues, including Haiti, and continued cooperation on key strategic defense guidance efforts. The PJBD reviewed a framework to guide NORAD modernization efforts to improve capabilities necessary for NORAD to conduct its aerospace and maritime warning and aerospace control missions. And notably, the deputy NORAD, J3, was part of the session delegation. But the PJBD isn't without its criticism. Existing institutions and organizations like the MCC and NORAD or bilateral naval arrangements maybe make the board redundant. Revered scholar J.T. Joppel, who served the U.S. section during the mid-1980s, pejoratively refers to the PJBD as the permanent joint window, where nothing of utility is discussed and it has become a talking shop that doesn't serve much purpose. The symbolism and legacy of King, Roosevelt, and LaGuardia loom over what's primarily historical academic analysis. How do NORAD representatives, given the Tri-Command framework, NORAD, CDROP, and NORTHCOM fit into these meetings? There's a Washington perspective, there's an Ottawa perspective, and there's a binational or Ottawa Springs perspective. Are NORAD reps solely providing technical advice, advocating on behalf of the commander? Are they advising the members along service or along section lines? Of course, meetings are classified for 25 years, so it's difficult to know. And NORAD modernization is already happening service to service because it's technicality. What impacts do the recommendations really have? It's simply up to the executive in each country to pass it on to the respective department or agency to carry it out. As the board operates in secrecy, it's difficult again to know in a contemporary context. And next slide, please. But some positive future considerations, policy recommendations include: one, North American defense is a priority again for decision makers. Meetings could increase from their yearly occurrences, and even the government of Canada's current background, PJBD 2014, says they meet twice a year. If we're in a similar threat environment to 1949, let alone 2014, this would still be less than the 4 times a year meetings held from 1945 to 1960. 2, the PJBD peaks and valleys in politics. In 1938, Canada's strategy was to obtain knowledge of, access to, and opportunities that influence U.S. thinking and plans for North American defense. Does this remain true today? I think the PJBD remains a bit for this consideration, especially because Ottawa has been excluded from recent Pacific-oriented regional security arrangements like Quad or AUKUS. The PJBD can show Canada a serious and interested in continental defense and is a trusted ally and partner that holds its weight in the Americans. 3, historically, Canada has valued the PJBD more than the U.S. has. It provides direct one-on-one access to practitioners in the most powerful nation in the world. The importance of Biden's appointment of Dalton cannot be overstated. It shows the U.S. has changed the thinking behind the co-chair position. The co-chair is not just someone that politically supports the president, like LaGuardia and Roosevelt. Dalton's a technical expert, an experienced practitioner, and that's really important given today's geopolitics. 4, the board will continue to benefit from secrecy, where large issues that are often technical and sensitive can be discussed at length, away from public scrutiny, away from politics, and away from media spotlight. 5, at the end of the day, the PJBD is an advisory body that's flexibly designed to study, advise, and make recommendations on any defense and security issue facing North America. its membership of government officials and positions to expedite considerations with the executive. It provides a more holistic representation than the MCC can provide. If now is not the time to revitalize the board with a renewed purpose, given the threat environment, then can it ever be useful again? And other Western thinking states who are neighbors like South Korea and Japan, or Australia and New Zealand, who share a security threat by China, that have similar economic, cultural, and geographic ties that America does, they might too benefit from the PGBD as a case study for binationalism. Next slide. The PJBD's agenda is largely a function of the gravity of purpose given external factors, just as it was born of the urgency of preparations to defend North America during World War II. A forum such as this is best suited to handle frank, private, and sensitive discussions to study and recommend solutions. Therefore, the PJBD should be a future source of cooperation between Ottawa and Washington. It allows for closed-door discussion on big issues in an era of hyper-partisanship and tension. The PJBD's value, as Jim Ferguson says, is a political arrangement, but with direct access to cut across bureaucratic obstacles and barriers to senior political authority for action and recommendations. Next slide, please. And perhaps David Beattie's landmark 1969 dissertation sums up the board's utility best. The PJBD acts as a clearinghouse in case of disagreement between the two nations over the exigencies of a particular defense project. And as Andrea Sharon says, the PJBD strives to forge a continental defense vision unconstrained by bureaucratic stovepipes. As the threat environment becomes even more complex, having the PJBD, even if it's redundant, to discuss mutual defense issues is still valuable. Its composition, structure, and its legacy of achieving consequential and incremental recommendations makes itself useful. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Like my intro, name is Leona, Senior Military Officer in the Canadian Armed Forces. Just to contextualize this presentation before I begin, so unlike the brilliant doctors I'm sitting beside, my research is a bit notes from the field. I recently had the privilege of deploying on Operation Reassurance as a commanding officer, working with 10 NATO nations on Canada's commitment to the Eastern Flank and for Russian deterrence. While I was there, a slice of my job was, I didn't know it was part of my job, but being a female in that region, I kind of got pigeonholed in it, which was a welcome pigeonhole because I got an opportunity to speak at the Riga conference, work with the Women, Peace and Security Ambassador of Canada to engage with civic society, government officials, as well as academics within the Baltics towards this agenda of women, peace and security. Next slide. So, what is it? When thinking about women, peace, and security, it often feels like a buzzword. Certainly it was for me when I began. It is conceptually understood by policymakers and governance enforcers, but hard to operationalize it at the tactical level by the boots on the ground. I think the intro of Ash and Isabelle's presentations this morning kind of shows you, we get it. There's all these great concepts and theories and research in the discourse. What are we doing on the ground? Sometimes it does feel like we're caught up on metrics, which are important. I don't want to trivialize that at all, but we all know it sometimes turns into a perfunctory indicator of success by a qualitative assessment of the true inclusion and embracement of diversity at all levels. This, I believe, requires transformational leadership, which is relational at all levels, vice mechanical compliance that we traditionally find in hierarchical security organizations. So NATO's first response to Resolution 1325 was a policy document drafted in 2007, which outlined the alliance's commitment to the WPS agenda. During 2010's Lisbon Summit, NATO adopted an action plan on the implementation of this resolution to develop a systematic approach to integrate gender perspectives into NATO-led operations and missions. So this is not new news. Today, the WPS is comprehensive. It calls on the international community to, among other things, promote and support women's active and meaningful participation in all conflict prevention and conflict resolution mechanisms and institutions, mainstream a gender perspective into all peace and security activities and strategies, including in the areas of peace negotiations, relief and recovery, peace operations, prevention of violence, extremism efforts, and reconciliation. What's the kicker to all this? You need women in those organizations. So current atmospherics clearly demonstrate that contemporary examples, and you can see the list there, plus more, that gender equality is a major driver of conflict. And we are seeing a reversal of generational gains in women's rights around the world, but it also corresponds with the global decline in democracy. And you see it in the news, and maybe not as forcefully as you should, but women's rights movements are some of the strongest opponents to authoritarian regimes around the world, bravely fighting in places like Iran and Afghanistan. That you can see traditionally right now. Next slide. So it's not all doom and gloom. I have a happy part to this story. So I feel like I have lived the fruits of the labor and the progression of these strategic level discussions of the WPS agenda. As I went from at the beginning of my career as a young LT being told, I can't sit in the front seat of a car, or I can't be without a man during key leader engagements, to just recently on Operation Reassurance being the commanding officer for that mission. And I was very surprised by this because I'm still in the fallacy of the westernized thinking. I can't be the first woman to do that in 2022. I was. So, but the good news here is I might have been the first, but I'm definitely not the last now because we've made a mark. Canada made a statement. But it was a bit unsettling because as the only woman around the table amongst 10 NATO nations, it just felt not right that it took this long. Carrie Buck recently made a statement at an AGM saying it took 66 years for Canada to appoint her. And I actually sent her a tweet recently. I said, the Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group that you helped craft as the NATO ambassador just appointed its first commanding officer last year. So thank you. So it's all these small micro moments that's building up. So not all doom. I was humbled to see this progress. It gives me hope that I certainly will not be the last as NATO evolves, as missions evolve, and I, along with many others, will continue to live at the tactical level the impacts of the WPS's agendas work at the operational strategic levels. Yet, at the same time, and I don't read off the slide, but you can see the battle group, it's made up of 10 NATO nations, with Canada leading it, was comprised of 3.6% women. Okay, that's over 1,000 soldiers, thousands of soldiers, and 3.6 of them are women from 10 NATO nations. And there's one woman at the decision making table, which is me. So you could imagine, yes, the metrics thing I'm telling you about is still a way to go. And the current atmospherics of the world, as we can see, show that women are usually excluded from peace negotiations or the decision making tables. And there are still prevailing stereotypes that depict females as victims. Feminism is still controversial, and we kind of saw it this morning in the disinformation, how dangerous and how highly charged some of these social issues can be, even in the era of Me Too and the mass commercialization of feminist ideas. Debates about equity, diversity, and inclusion, spanning from gender to race, remain inherently political. Norms about gender are embedded within institutions and cultures, making them difficult to change. The most hardened target is perhaps the military, an institution that has evolved by glorifying stereotypical interpretations of masculinity. However, what can be taken out of adversity and hardship are lessons. This is the beautiful thing about life. I love this quote I heard when I was over there, where they say, in war, we don't have the privilege of inequality. And what the context of this quote is that currently right now, 25% of the Ukrainian armed forces are women, and they refuse to cede an inch of progress on reforms despite the immense challenges that wars bring. So on one perspective, it shows the amazing resilience of Ukrainian people, Ukrainian women who smashed that door open when the opportunity presented itself. But on the other hand, it shows that out of necessity to fight for sovereign borders, that's what it took for the realization we need all hands on deck and no longer can we marginalize half the population. because we need everyone that there is. So this is my question to the West. While we have the privilege of relative time and peace, why not seize this not as an institutional crisis, as the Canadian Armed Forces calls it, but an institutional opportunity by waiting for an adverse moment to make us realize it and build the plane as it is flying like we like doing. So, next slide. So conversations like this are not only important, but vital to personalize these concepts that state that women are good for peace, women are good for conflict resolution, and women increase operational effectiveness. However, I ask, could we not just break open societal and cultural norms that we have all had to assimilate to through our different lived experiences and just come to a point where women don't have to prove their value or worth through operational outputs and having to convince people of their value, and rather just at the table because it's the right thing to do. That it is intuitive to be equal, to be dignified, and we have our place on the social hierarchy. Imagine, this is for my male colleagues in the room, not to single you out, but having to convince everyone how good for business you are, instead of just valued. For too many people in organizations, the concept of gender integration is considered a minority issue and an afterthought, rather than an issue that helps framing the right answer. What separates us from our adversaries are our values that we stand for: freedom, human rights, equality. If these are the things we are willing to fight for and potentially defend with our lives, we need to ensure we're walking the walk within our own forces. We need to be completely aligned with the societies that we're saying that we're defending. If we want to get people on board, it is important to talk about this in concrete terms. And in the military, it's operational effectiveness. So we need to use the language that will resonate. So we will listen. But the range of security tasks we're being asked to do are broader and broader. I'll give you a couple anecdotal examples. Ukrainians, women raped during war, fleeing as refugees to Poland, pregnant. Poland might not have the same views on abortion or same rights or whatever. Who's best to deal with that as maybe the nation's head? Security checkpoints for terrorism. Who says a woman can't carry a bomb across the border? Who's going to check them? Who are the most vulnerable populations that cross into refugee camps? Babies, girls, boys, women, the minorities. So that just kind of gives you the range of conflicts that you can face. The other thing is, it could be a huge intelligence gathering tool as well for operational effectiveness. I love using this quote. So like I was saying, when I was a lieutenant, I was told I can't sit in the front seat of a car or be without a man during key leader engagements. And, I am all about respecting the culture of the country. That is fine. But if there's a rule like that, then the women aren't talking to the men soldiers. Maybe they'll talk to women soldiers that are at the watering hole doing something, or they're getting their hair done. Like, who knows? Not to be stereotypical, but there's a way that people might resonate and give valuable information that might save lives or make better plans with comprehensive information, not one-dimensional with blind spots. And also, considering all your members' needs leads to increased trust, cohesion, morale, and will to fight, and is Ukraine ever showing a momentous advantage on the battlefield because of this? Every time the military has found itself in crisis over the last 20 years, usually the news isn't saying it's because we weren't effective or we didn't receive success in the mission. Right now, and the prevailing theme is that we have treated people badly. And right now, I'm sure everyone's kept up with defense news of sexual misconduct, racism, sexism, homophobia. This kind of stuff corrodes morale, trust, and leaves the military weaker, even to adversary attacks on our credibility. Also significantly decreases the recruiting pool when women can't see themselves as a valued part of that organization or feel safe within it. So at the beginning, I made that joke. It's like, we have this great strategic WPS agenda where we're calling on the international community for women to do this and women to be at these tables. The kicker is you need women. And right now we have a recruiting and retention problem because people can't see themselves in the organization or we're not doing enough. It might just be a little bit of virtue signaling or an appearance of it. And I do not say that to trivialize any of the amazing efforts of the people working on this file right now, but this is the reality of what the atmospherics that we're working. Also, not having diverse teams leads to severe blind spots. You might not understand the lived experiences of members on your team, of kit not fitting properly, women childbearing. What does that do to career progression? Do you have to choose between career and family? And this is not isolated just to the military. We are a microcosm of greater society. So that's why I call it military application and beyond, because it is incumbent on all of us and all leaders and all organizations to think about this. And our adversaries understand gender dimensions in operations, even if we choose not to, even if we don't like it, and they will use it against us. Next slide. So I was talking about the very micro. So one is the operational effectiveness and just the integrity of just being valued. This is taking it to the macro, and I won't read it out loud, but it increases 35% probability of peace agreements. You know, it increases GDP by 12 trillion in a single decade by including more women at these important avenues of socioeconomic and political arenas. When I find that this is really hard for people to resonate with, I just say, let's think about this very nuclear in the moment. In a family unit of two parents, if both parents can read, probably more likely both of them get a job. And if both of them can get a job, you will naturally make more money. So you blow that up 1,000 times, a million times, that's the world. So these stats have been studied and are backed up. So why do we still need to explain this agenda to people that it is good for democracy? It is good for world peace. It is good for our economy. Next slide. So, what's the silver bullet? There isn't one. But one of the big conversations, topics that I had when I was in Lithuania and all over Latvia, talking with government officials, and civic society, and academics who are working on these files for their countries in their region. They're like, what do we do? Because Canada is considered such a leader in this space, believe it or not. And as much as we have a lot of work to do, we are leaps and bounds ahead. So that's good. But the prevailing question from the Baltics was, where do we begin and what do we do besides making a national action plan on this? It is one thing, as we all know, to create strategic ideas, concepts, policies, but how do we operationalize them to institutions and the people within them to transform, to sustain these ideas and concepts? I'm not saying that this is the be all end all, but it's my presentation. So this is my theory. And I made an analogy because I find that if you leave people with a little anecdote story that they can remember, it will stick with you more than just a checklist like you must do this, and it turns profound. I will ask you of the analogy of how do you keep a tree alive? Okay. I truly believe you require the soil, the water, the sun, and the air. And one without the other may give appearance of activity or a short life, but nothing that will be sustainable and live a long time. So in any organization at any level, I offer the following. Starting with the soil, you need the policies, directives, doctrine. You need to establish that framework of everything that we're trying to achieve. So that is things like your national action plan. Then you need to educate and train your people, not solely through check in the box online courses, but you need credible leaders and experts that can socialize, train, and teach your teams on the soil. Then you need the sun. You need the governance where boundaries are clear. You have clear oversight to test and adjust because we won't get it right and it doesn't need to be perfect, but we need the ability to test and adjust. And you need to be able to provide support to the people within the system doing the work. And you need governance that doesn't make people feel like, I shouldn't do this because I'm going to get in trouble. I shouldn't do this because it's the right thing to do. And I love this kind of other little anecdote I'll leave with this. It's like a speeding ticket. Are you speeding because you don't want to get a speeding ticket? Or are you not speeding? Imagine people stop speeding because they don't want to hurt kids in a school zone that are trying to go walk back home to their families after school. You know, So imagine the difference it would make if it clicked in people's mind. I'm not doing something because of reprisal or cancel culture or whatever. I'm not doing it because it's the right thing to do. But you need to make sure people can understand that. And that is only through socialization, education, and the proper governance to manage that. And the last is the air, which we cannot take for granted, which is the one kind of delta I see in the CAP right now, as well as NATO, is we cannot take for granted is leaders, not managers, who are mechanically compliant because you'll get in trouble or you will get promoted now because this is the woke culture as kind of the current narratives are prevailing. But we need transformational leaders at each requisite level, which can set that command climate, have the courage to listen, to learn, to unlearn, be able to show empathy and vulnerability to lead humans through uncomfortable discussions to bring people together. That is leadership. And we think it's some sort of brain surgery, but just treat people like humans. And I told this earlier, is if at every interaction, man, woman, boy, girl, doesn't matter, non-binary. If at every micro interaction at the water cooler or in your office or when you're mentoring or when you're doing something, you can make that person feel, do you care? Do you understand? And do you hear me? If you can meet those three, I can guarantee you that because of that relation, now they might think twice before they say something if they know you're gay, if they know you're a female, or they might have had a misconception about Black people or Asians or women not being able to lead. Everything is built on connection and love, as much as we might not like to talk about that in the defense industry. We are in the human business. And without humans, we cannot inflict violence on behalf of the state, because that is our job. We can't forget that part of our job. But they're not mutually exclusive. I think people like to think, well, how can I be this unified state tool arm for the state to inflict violence on others if necessary and still be soft and fluffy? They feel like vulnerability is weak, but actually vulnerability is strength. So that, how do you keep it trailing? Okay. Next slide. From my perspective, from what I saw over the last 7 months while I was in Latvia, I see Canada at the forefront of WPS efforts, with the only government who has appointed a WPS ambassador, Jackie O'Neill. I have seen firsthand the impact that this position can have globally, bringing people together to start having these conversations around the world. As an extension of Canada's foreign policy and WPS ambassador, we need to seize the influence, this credibility, the support we can lend, and the humanity that we do have as Canadians, and bring it every time we are waving our flag somewhere. Although my influence and lending of support was at a very micro level during my deployment, the women and men I met in the Baltics who were inspired by Canada's example of being able to deploy a woman commanding officer to lead 10 NATO nations as the framework nation senior national representative, which to some seemed like something that could never happen from their countries. The countless soldiers and from other nations and even our own Canadians who felt heard, seen, or safer just by having representation at the table is a key takeaway that Canada could feel good. So in summary, this is not a woman's issue or a man's issue. It's a human issue that requires all of us to collectively push. I will say this, until I see around every goddamn table, 1 woman around every table is a token, 2 is a minority, and 3 means we're getting there. And I consider that until we see that day, collectively, our job is done. And really, if you do consider yourself a leader in any organization, it doesn't matter, academia, institution, defense, whatever, business. The question is simple. Do you want to lead some people or do you want to lead all people? Thank you very much.
I'm going to take a cue from Thomas here, and I'm going to pass around the microphone for those who have questions in person live, so that our colleagues on the internet, I'm not sure how many are left now, can hear this. So, questions? All questions? Qu'est-ce qu'on va faire? As they say in the House of Commons.
I'll ask a question if no one.
Sure.
Magnificent, thank you very much. So I've got a slightly pointed question for you, and yeah. So the question is, what difference did it make that you were around the table in our reassurance? So that might, blow your own trumpet on that one. But if we do the counterfactual, if it hadn't been you, it had been somebody else from the camp.
So. Yeah, I'll give you one example. And so there was a sexual misconduct type of things that happened. And not every country, and I won't name countries, but have the same view on how we should deal with those things. Okay, so something happened to a Canadian person from another country. I was like, this needs to be investigated right away. Because to me, I know what a trauma-informed approach is. I know as a lived experience as a woman in the military, so on. I just knew that this is not something that could be swept under the rug. I was ready to create an international incident over that. What I found though, is when I was in the room, they were saying the right things. But I had really great male allies who were reporting back to me, this country is not taking it seriously. They're actually thinking of counter claiming something that the female's making up things to ruin the male's life. So she should be banished from the base and so on and so forth. Luckily, I had those kind of moles everywhere to know. And I was ready to, they just knew where the command climate was set and what the boundaries were, that I would take it to their nations. And that's the game that we play on the international stage at the UN. How do we get other countries to do stuff? Shaming, right? So incidences like that, I feel like me being there is almost a deterrence and an enforcer of good behavior, that they know better, even if they don't believe it, at least the climate is set. And because Canada is the framework nation on operations, it really doesn't matter if the 10 NATO nations don't want to listen to you because you're a woman. They have to by the chain of command rules. But I didn't want to lead with positional power. I wanted to lead with people. So right away, I got to work with these 10 men who are like my brothers, and they're still texting me. So it just goes to show you that just connecting with people on a human dimension can really transcend culture, language, lived experiences, belief system. And there are 3 key things that I found that can kind of join people together no matter what. It's music, sports, and food. So I'll just say, you got to use everything in the toolbox. Also, the amount of, I won't name which countries, but there's about 4 main countries out of the 10 where corporals, sergeants, officers of those nations were coming up to me. Actually, almost crying or thanking me because they felt like they were taking some ownership or like it was an extension of their success and they're seeing progress, which was really, really touching. And they felt safe coming to me with information that they wouldn't have felt safe going to their male chain of command. And this is not to paint a picture that the male chain of command is terrible. It's just there's something to be said about what men feel comfortable discussing with other men and what women might feel comfortable discussing with women. So.
Excellent. Next question. Dr. Hiebert is a new person in the audience, so we're going to do next.
Thank you very much for excellent presentation, discussion on each of them. My question, however, is for the names right. Nicholas, given the changing environment that we now see in terms of the security relationship between Canada and the US, and given the types of funding challenges that Canada has faced, what is the role of PGE in this context? I mean, you outlined it as it's gone professional, and I agree with you on that context. But I mean, there are many concerns that are arising, and Canada is going to be increasingly seen as irrelevant for American defense needs. So what do you see does that mean that the PGE is just going to simply disappear or be irrelevant as well, or do you see it going in this context? And for economists, how do you have confidence building with an aggressor state?
usually tend to see as not homeless weight relative to the Americans or relative to the Americans. PGD is not the place to sort of hide for technical discussion of patient or sensitive technologies that can't be specified by the third side. It's too technical, and that's why I don't really think it's going to matter what they do. I don't think that it's going to change clearly. There's too much happening elsewhere. Our services can do on that. I just don't know if the desire of American part that you're what? I don't know who's watching. No, I don't really see it the having this big play, but it could because of its structure, its construction, units. Do the Americans value that as much as we do? I think so, because often is there. Perhaps. No, I don't know if that answers your question. It does.
I love that question. I'll give you the really short answer first. It can't. And in fairness, that was well understood when the first set of confidence building measures were brought in. The concept of this was to prevent a very specific type of conflict developing. And it's the conflict developing from misunderstanding. And so they said, okay, if we do end up with this catastrophic Soviet invasion, it's happened. We can't do anything about it. But the last thing we want is for that to happen by accident. So that was the central function of them. So like I say, it isn't going to prevent the aggression in that sense. So then the question I think becomes to is, are China and Russia just aggressive states and in the Arctic context? Perhaps, I mean, one tiny little thing to note first, in the latest invasion of Ukraine, I found it really interesting. It's the first time in my knowledge that either the Soviet Union or any NATO member had acknowledged that an exercise was going to become an invasion. Like you had Biden saying in December, this is going to happen. So in a sense, what the confidence building measure had done, it had acted as the tripwire. And it's actually to show you that an actor is aggressive in a certain way or in a certain type of way. So what I think they're potentially useful for is to getting slightly more nuanced. And it comes back to that, what are you building confidence in? And I don't think, given the current environment, given Russia being what it is, it can't be all-encompassing in the Arctic, much as we might like it to, because I don't think the intention is to play nicely anyway. But what one might be able to do is say, okay, if Russia is concerned about certain dual-use basing in a certain place, and we know that that is actually not a threat to them, okay, let's be open about that and use that as a reciprocal, in order to press for a reciprocal arrangement which allows us to see something of theirs, whether that's the pressure, long-range bombers and the like. And the key there for me is, again, that then becomes not capability building, but it's about determining intent. So if you come to an agreement that, look, we know the rule is stay out of our airspace, the new rule is everyone stays 20 kilometers outside. Forget the function of it. The value is, well, if you come 19 kilometers, you're no longer playing by the rules. You're not playing by the rules. We've got a problem. So you can't use it only as your only intelligence gathering tool. But I think there is still a possibility to use it for a method to better understand the adversary's intent. And that's potentially helpful. Like I said, if the whatever hits the fan, like it's out of the window anyway, and it might be that we're too far gone in the Arctic already for that. I hope not. But the other part of the conversation then, which is what Brian and Dr. Ahmad are looking at, is to be a bit more nuanced about what does threat actually look like in the Arctic. And that's a really useful conversation to have, and it starts from the confidence building. And what do you need to see in order to be happier with the environment? I had a fantastic interview with a very senior Russian diplomat, and his primary point, and it was the one point after thinking about what he'd said, which I actually agreed with, and he gave me like the steer on this. He said that we've got these blanket terms, but what we're worried about is very different to what you're worried about. So why are we agreeing the same things? Why can't we open the box again and you tell us what we want to know, we tell you what you want to know? Obviously, they're not going to do that, but the principle holds. And I think that's the opportunity for a conversation. So yeah, you can't stop an aggressor. This is not going to do that, but it might tell you when they're about to be aggressive.
The question against the Thomas and Bill Brian, just for both, first question for Thomas and Bill, and the question for you. The first, let's say, for London kind of confidence against perception or perceptions. Looking at the numbers of 20,000 people for 250,000 troops, 250 kilometers away, in the context of this additional like what's the rationale behind getting up to 250,000 and it's kilometers, and how is that going to achieve as well? 800 ISIS men took over an entire city in Iraq that was full of tens of thousands well-trained, like soldiers trained troops, well equipped with weapons, and tens of thousands of security forces who led the city in the matter of 12 hours. So how many can give it? 150,000 troops, that's way an army, right? And 250 kilometers nowadays is nothing. That's all they can see, right? That's the question. The other question to Ron, again, another great presentation going forward. If I talk about the politicization of security by states, do you find that across the board, or specifically, or more so by certain governments with different political departments rather than public? Thank you.
Thank you. Right, I'll try and give a rapid answer. It's really cool. I'm glad you asked it. So it's 25,000. I might have made a mistake on the side. It's 25,000 for within 250 kilometers. And the simple answer, it was negotiated. So at that point, NATO were. It sounds weird to think about this, but NATO were actually running bigger exercises than the Soviet Union in general. It was just what happened. So the Soviets wanted a higher threshold for numbers, because then they could run exercises which weren't captured by it, but NATO exercises still would be captured. NATO wanted to see further, have a bigger than 250 kilometer radius, because they felt like the Soviets could already see into NATO territory. We couldn't see into their territory. So they balanced it. I think the original request was for 450 kilometers, and the Soviets wanted 50,000 troops. And NATO were like, no, that's not going to work. So they balanced it. And like I say, so you end up with a situation where neither side are actually seeing what they want to see initially. I mean, what they actually wanted from the original negotiation. Big bits up from the archive, but it's a bit tricky. And then so that came down because they started to recognize, exactly as you said, like you can do a lot of damage with 20,000 troops. So why don't we drop that? I didn't put it up to nuance. The latest set of the figure of the Vienna document, it's really quite nuanced on equipment that you can use and that sort of thing. The 86 Stockholm document extended it from the 250 kilometers to anywhere in the zone of application. So it actually goes all the way up to the Urals. Now, that was also NATO, from a position of strength in the early 1980s, just hammered Soviet Union to allow that to happen. And like I said, the problem now is that it was 2011, 13,000 troops is still, it's a lot, but you could do a lot of damage with less than that. And notification time doesn't reflect what actually constitutes a threat today. Russia is refusing to open it again. They're actually in breach of it. We're supposed to renew it every 4 or 5 years. And they've said, no, we're not going to reopen this because of the security environment is too tense right now. We don't think it would be helpful. It was pretty darn tense in 1986. So you opened it then. I don't know why. So they're refusing to do it because, in my opinion, they think they've got the better side of the deal right now. And if we did see it, I think we would have to explode it further to look at cybersecurity. Like, there's so many other areas that we're worried about, and we need greater confidence that they do not intend to do this bad thing. But that, like I say, it's come back to the problem of negotiation. Both sides want to end up using this to enhance their own capability and enhance their perception of the security environment, or their perception of the security environment is safe. And they're coming at it from different directions. So,
thank you. For your question, I looked at Canada only. When is it politicization? It's when you're in government. So, for instance, I didn't talk about the case study, but Stephen Harper did securitize and move around what has become the Arctic offshore patrol ships. He won government and then immediately had to start walking it back in that securitizing language. He had a bit of grace period because he always blamed the Liberals for neglect. But as time went on, he was in power longer, he had to walk things back. Similarly, the securitization language for Polar Sea was pushed by the Liberals in opposition. So they were pushing the government to do something. The government didn't want to respond. They did it very rapidly, got it out of the way, and it's just that was my observation writ large. When you're in government, you politicize. When you're in opposition, you securitize, and that seems to give the best political benefit to whatever position your parties are in power. Yes. Thanks.
Any questions online? Okay. Out to the room. Other questions? Going once. Oh, Ron.
Thank you. I'm just taking advantage of someone else does, since you've had such a rich discussion. And then this one for you. And I'm afraid I didn't quite catch the title. Is it general or colonel? Lieutenant colonel. As we move forward, I'm listening to your comments, and particularly on Haval and the efficiency that we sacrifice. But they're taking back the challenge that the Americans faced in the Second World War. They, of course, dealt with the same issue with African Americans. And I think of the Red Tails, I think of all the contributions once, they've gotten finally put in there, being a carrier after an African American or a state administration. But my question to you is to look forward to a geopolitical environment that is obviously going to have a much higher risk of war fighting rather than simply war deterrent, peacekeeping, all the elements we're used to. How do we then address the issues that you so eloquently highlighted? But then how do we try to ensure that just as the Americans have to go through very painful elements of how to properly integrate the African Americans as a fighting unit rather than as coordinated, and move forward into real more like it's often said, or still something fundamentally different in terms of staying, language, killing, dying. How do we then bring that factor into the preparation going ahead on top of the challenges that we've already identified?
This is the $1 million question, I think, and all the security sector right now is how do we fix this, and how do we integrate this to the current geopolitical picture, also in the future. And I don't think there is a singular one-dimensional answer to this. It will take a visionary, courageous leader with the help of civic society that can rally around, which I believe that Canada is at the forefront. Just because I saw the credibility that Canada was lending in the Baltics through the Women, Peace and Security Investment, but just at a very crazy level, and I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. But for NATO membership, we are a NATO membership in the West with people that do not align with the values that we say we have as Canadians, or even as, for example. But we are now in business with them, and now with everything with globalization put on its head, where the theory was you'll never go to wolves when you're in business. right? Or that democracy is good, or that the hegemon should remain the US. All of these concepts that we have lived experience with, that we have learned in schools and we believe are kind of turning on its head right now. So we're maybe at an inflection point where it's going to take informed civic society that can rally behind a leader, behind a country that will say NATO membership, because that is the only way that change can happen. Because right now, this is just going to continue being more appearance of activity while pushing things, good progressive things. I don't want to realize the amounts of amazing stuff that has happened over, the last 20 years, especially in this space. But we'll continue to do it incrementally and slowly instead of just knocking down the door and seizing the opportunity. Because I do believe that the West is so privileged that we probably aren't going to face what Ukraine is facing. And for me, the question is never if, it's when. And that's why I say, while we are in the presence of relative peace and security, why not seize this moment to get it right now? And I'm just waiting for some courageous leader, visionary leader somewhere to start that fight so we can mobilize behind that and start having these frank, uncomfortable discussions with countries. But three things I think that it's going to bring in: it's limitless consumption, ungoverned capitalism, and algorithms. And if we don't find a way to control these three, we're in big trouble as a human race. When we lose that critical thinking piece. So the answer to everything for me is leadership. So I hope that answers your question. I know that really did.
Any other questions? Got a little bit of time left. Rob, you have more questions? All right. Well, this brings our proceedings to a close. Thank you so much to all of our attendees, all of our panelists. As I predicted at the very beginning, these were indeed excellent presentations and fantastic discussions with our president and askers, I guess, in the audience. Thank you so much to those who are joining us or who remain from afar, particularly the tech department involved in the video. You kind of hung in there with us at the beginning to get the little owl over here doing the right thing. And thank you again, of course, to the staff, Rhonda, Mary, and Melissa. Without whom none of this would have happened, because we would just like to be in JC. Well, so thank you again. I believe we have kind of a final event, a kind of informal reception at the last event's lounge here. I think you were set to start that around 4:30 or so. I guess everybody has a map, so we know how to get there. Who's not from the campus? It's really not that far, but we'll probably kind of go over in a giant group anyway. And so with that, let us all give ourselves a big hand, and thank you.